Hey, I'm Mr. Ghost. If you love true horror stories, consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow. The stories you'll hear are shared by our audience from Reddit, and to keep their original essence, I read them exactly as they were written. Before we begin, let me know in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? Also, check the timestamps in the comments for story titles and easy navigation. Now, let's dive into the darkness. I saw a skinwalker, born 23 years old, female, born from Russia, but I grew up in England. Anyways, my family used to go back to Russia during the summer. I think it was 2012, 2013. So I would have been about 12. We were at my house in Russia for the summer. My siblings, my cousins and I were playing on the street at around 7:30 p.m. It was still pretty light. Me and one of my cousins were the oldest there, so we continued playing outside, just the two of us, when my younger siblings and cousins went inside to bathe and go to bed. At this point it was 10:11 p.m., but we were still outside. There was a small forest behind my house. Me and my cousin were sure we had been to every inch of that forest, so we decided to go exploring in it. I don't know why, but we did. Around 20 minutes in, and nothing unusual had happened, until we came to a massive clearing in the forest. No trees or plants except grass were growing there. We had never seen this part of the forest before. It was strange because this clearing was huge, and until now we thought we had been through the entire forest. We had these little torches that surprisingly gave a lot of light. I shined it to a part of the clearing about 300 feet away from us, and when I tell you we fucking froze. There was a man who looked like he was from the Second World War. He had a tent set up and had a fire going, and he was literally dressed how soldiers were during World War II. We didn't say anything because my dad and uncle had taught us not to in situations like this. But we couldn't move. We just stayed still. The man hadn't seen us. He had his back to us, and he started shouting help. We could see he wasn't in any danger at all. We quickly and quietly ran out of there. We could still see him from far away, still shouting for help, and it looked like he was looking for something. My cousin suggested we help him in case he genuinely needed help, but I could tell he didn't. While we were trying to find the way out of the forest, the shouting stopped, and we lost sight of the man. But we saw a deer, and you could tell from the way it was moving and its eyes that there was no way it wasn't something paranormal. We started running faster, and deers supposedly run away when you make noise. But no, this deer was chasing us. We finally got away and found my house. We told my grandma, who was the only one awake, and she told us to take her there in the morning. That morning at around 7 a.m., we got up and tried to find the clearing. We hit almost everything in that forest, and the clearing was nowhere to be found. It was like it had vanished, and there was no sign of a campfire. Also, there was a sign at the front of the forest that said no wildlife or anything lived in the forest, and that camping was forbidden. In the last 12 years we have searched that forest, and we never found the clearing ever again. The death experiment. I'm not much for religion like Christianity or Buddhism. People ask me, why would I make such a choice to be part of such an experiment? Well, the clear answer is this. When my wife and my son died in a car crash on a freeway, I became depressed and mentally unstable. Why not be part of such an experiment to prove that there's an afterlife, that my wife and my son are somewhere in this universe? Here's my story of what I experienced in the death experiment. I was sitting on my couch, watching TV, when suddenly there was a knock at my door. I looked through the peephole, and I saw two strange men standing outside, dressed in black suits with ties, holding a briefcase. Out of curiosity, I opened the door. One of the men asked me a strange question. Would you like to be part of an experiment called the death experiment? A flood of thoughts crashed through my mind, each one louder than the last. Was this some kind of joke? Were they serious? The death experiment? The words echoed inside my head. What kind of experiment was that? What did they mean by death? But then I thought about my wife, my son, the violent wreck on the freeway, the empty spaces they left behind. What if this was it? What if this was the answer I had been searching for? Why question it when the name said it all? The death experiment. I exhaled sharply, my fingers twitching at my sides. How do I sign up? Where do I join? I asked. The man with the briefcase gave a slight nod, his expression unreadable. "If you come with us now, you can join immediately." They turned, walking toward a sleek black car parked along the curb, the tinted windows swallowing any reflection of the streetlights above. My body moved on its own, my pulse hammering as I stepped outside, closing the door behind me. I slid into the back seat, buckled in, and felt the cold leather press against my back. The driver pulled away smoothly, the hum of the engine filling the silence. The city streets blurred past in streaks of neon and shadow, but soon we veered away from the familiar. The roads became darker, more isolated. The farther we drove, the more I realized we weren't heading anywhere ordinary. Then I saw it. A massive, polished white facility loomed ahead, a monolith against the night sky. It was impossibly large, both wide and tall, stretching out like a fortress. The exterior gleamed under the harsh floodlights mounted along its perimeter, giving it an almost sterile glow, but something about it felt wrong. Armed guards stood like statues at the front gates, their faces hidden beneath dark visors. Their rifles were held firmly across their chests, fingers resting near the triggers. Surveillance cameras dotted every corner, their red lights blinking in slow, measured intervals. As we approached, the heavy metal gates groaned open, sliding apart with mechanical precision. The car pulled through, gliding down a long, straight path leading to the facility's main entrance. Two towering doors made of reinforced steel, their smooth surfaces unmarked by any signage. The moment we stopped, one of the men stepped out and opened my door. "Follow me." I obeyed, stepping onto the pavement. The air was cold, laced with the faint smell of antiseptic and something metallic. I walked with them toward the entrance, my shoes tapping against the pristine concrete. As we reached the doors, a small red scanner flickered to life, reading the man's face. A quiet beep followed, and the heavy doors unlocked with a deep mechanical thunk. Inside, the facility was eerily silent. The walls were a sterile white, the floors polished to a mirror-like shine. The ceiling stretched high above, lined with long fluorescent lights that buzzed softly. As we walked further, I noticed reinforced doors on either side of the hallway, each labeled only with numbers. No names, no descriptions. At the end of the corridor was a reception desk, manned by another figure in a black suit. The woman behind the desk barely looked up as the man beside me handed over a thin folder. A few quick stamps, a quiet murmur between them, and then she gestured toward another door. "Proceed," she said flatly. We moved through, stepping into what looked like a waiting area. The furniture was minimalist, the air too still. Before I could process it all, a door on the other side swung open. A man in a white lab coat entered. He was tall, thin, with sharp features and a gaze that seemed to look through me rather than at me. He carried a clipboard, his fingers drumming lightly against its surface. "So, you're the patient," he said, his voice smooth but clinical. I met his stare. "If that's what you're calling me." He gave a thin smile. "Welcome to Nexus." The name sent a chill through me. "Nexus?" I asked. "What even is this place?" The doctor adjusted his glasses, tapping his pen against his clipboard. "Nexus, the Neurological Experimentation and Xenogenesis Understanding Syndicate." His eyes gleamed under the sterile light. A government-funded facility dedicated to one thing, exploring what lies beyond the threshold of death. His words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. And in that moment, I realized I had truly stepped into something I couldn't escape. The man in the black suit stepped forward, setting the briefcase on a nearby metal table with a dull clank. The doctor took it without a word, his fingers ghosting over the latches before flipping them open with two sharp clicks. A stack of neatly bound bills filled the interior, row after row of crisp, unmarked $100 bills. The sight of it made my stomach twist. Curiosity gnawed at me. "What's in that briefcase anyway?" I asked, my voice steady, despite the unease creeping up my spine, the one they showed up with at my doorstep. The doctor didn't hesitate. "Money," he said plainly. I frowned. "How much?" He glanced at me, adjusting his glasses. $50 million. I blinked. $50 million. He nodded as if it were nothing. "And there's another briefcase waiting for you. Same amount." The weight of his words settled in my chest. $100 million. Enough to disappear. Enough to rewrite a life. But there was a catch. There was always a catch. I exhaled. What's the catch? The doctor smirked. You complete the experiment. You keep your mouth shut. He snapped the briefcase shut with finality. This is top secret. Only a few are selected every few years. You were chosen. His eyes locked onto mine, cold and unreadable. And for the first time since stepping into this facility, I realized I wasn't just signing up for an experiment. I was signing away everything. The doctor's gaze lingered on me for a moment before he straightened his coat and exhaled. Are you ready? I swallowed hard, my throat dry. He nodded once. All right, come on. He gestured with a tilt of his head, turning toward the hallway. Without hesitation, I followed. 2 armed bodyguards fell into step behind us, their heavy boots echoing against the polished white floor. The corridor stretched long, sterile, and unwelcoming, lined with identical doors on both sides, each one locked, each one hiding something. We walked in silence, my pulse a steady drumbeat in my ears. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, and something else, something metallic. The overhead lights flickered once, just enough to make my skin prickle. A turn, then another. With each step, the walls seemed to press closer, the fluorescent lights casting elongated shadows. Finally, the doctor stopped in front of an unmarked door, pressing his palm against a scanner. A low beep sounded, followed by the soft hiss of the lock disengaging. The door swung open. Inside, the room was cold and clinical. A metal table sat in the center, draped with a white sheet. Beside it, hospital equipment hummed quietly. Monitors, IV stands, and a heart rate monitor that blinked expectantly. The air carried a sharp, sterile scent, mingling with something unmistakable, anticipation. I stepped inside, my stomach knotting as the doctor followed. The bodyguards remaining just outside. This was it. No turning back now. The doctor let out a quiet sigh, tapping a finger against his clipboard. Get on the table. His tone was sharp, but not unkind. Just business. I hesitated for a moment, before finally pushing myself up and onto the cold metal surface. The paper sheet crinkled beneath me as I settled in. The air smelled like antiseptic, sharp and sterile. The doctor moved with practiced efficiency, reaching for the helmet resting beside a bank of machines at the front of the room. It was sleek and metallic, wires extending from the sides, feeding into the screens displaying rolling waves of brain activity. This helmet, he began, adjusting the fit over my head, will monitor everything happening in your brain in real time. Every electrical impulse, every reaction, as you transition through different states of consciousness. He secured it snugly, the metal cool against my scalp. First you'll experience a near-death state. Your life may flash before your eyes. That's just your brain processing its own shutdown. A final burst of neural activity before he snapped his fingers. It starts to fade. He moved quickly, attaching electrodes to my temples, my wrists, my chest. The machines beeped steadily, recording my vitals. But that's not what we're looking for, he continued, adjusting a few dials. We're searching for what happens after, when the brain ceases all function. No more activity, no more signals. He glanced at me, his expression unreadable. If something remains, anything, then we've found our answer. The hum of the machines grew louder. The wires tugged slightly as he made final adjustments. Are you ready? He asked, standing over me now, fingers hovering over the controls. I exhaled. My heart pounded. Yes. The doctor picked up a syringe filled with a clear liquid, tapping it twice before pressing the needle against the inside of my arm. This will slow your heart rate and guide you into a controlled death, he murmured. The cold sting of the needle pierced my skin, a slow pressure flooding through my veins. The machines beeped steadily, then slowed. Count down from 10, the doctor instructed. Or a higher number if that helps. I swallowed, my tongue heavy. 10, 9. My voice faltered. My limbs felt weightless, my fingers tingling. 7. My breath shuddered. My heartbeat thudded in my ears, slowing with each beat. 6. The lights above me blurred, the doctor's face turning into a hazy silhouette. 5. Everything slipped away. The last thing I heard was the prolonged, unbroken beep of the heart monitor. Then, nothing, a void. An endless, suffocating emptiness. No sound, no light, no thought, just absence. A sudden burst of light pierced through the blackness, sharp and blinding. The world around me flickered, strange and fast, like I was watching a reel of old film, but backward, racing through moments that didn't belong in my head. It wasn't just a memory, it felt like I was there, reliving it all, but in reverse. First, I saw the mangled wreck of the car. My car, twisted and crumpled. The bodies of my wife and son, lifeless, broken, their faces pale and still. The sound of sirens, the rush of air, the tension that filled the air. Then, it unraveled. Their bodies began to move. The blood was sucked back into their wounds. Their faces twisted back into a peaceful stillness, as if they were merely asleep. Slowly, the broken pieces of metal that had once pinned them in place pushed themselves back into their rightful spots, and the car itself began to uncrumple, shifting back to its original form. And then, life. My son's laughter echoed in the air, the sound of his tiny hands gripping my fingers. My wife's smile, warm and loving, filled my heart as she ran her fingers through my hair. I could feel the love they had for me. All of it. I felt my son's small body snuggling against me, his soft breath against my neck, the deep, overwhelming love of a family. But it all moved backward, their joy turning to the silence of death. I felt their sadness too, the quiet moments when they had worried about me, when I wasn't the man I should have been, the days they spent holding their breath, hoping I would snap out of it. I saw myself, older, jaded, angry. I could feel the weight of my choices, the toll I had taken on everyone around me, the people I had hurt, the friends I'd pushed away, the promises I'd broken. I felt their hurt, the quiet anger they'd buried, and the disappointment in their eyes. The pain was raw, as if it had just happened, as if it was still happening. But then, the love, the smiles. I could feel it, the warmth of moments I cherished, the people I cared about, my parents, my friends, the strangers I'd helped when I could, the laughter of those who found joy in the smallest of things. I felt their happiness like a warmth spreading through my chest, the relief they'd felt when they found peace in their own lives. Their joys weren't just theirs, they were mine too, because I had been there for them even when I didn't realize it. But it was all unraveling, the memories good and bad, dissolving into the blackness once more. And then, the beginning, the innocence of childhood, when the world was new and wide and waiting. I saw my mother and father smiling at me, the way they'd looked down at me with love in their eyes, the warmth of my first steps, the joy of my first words, the quiet moments spent in their embrace. But before I could reach the start, before I could even fully understand it, the light flickered, and then, again, nothing. Blackness swallowed everything. I gasped, a sharp breath filling my lungs as I jerked awake. The sterile smell of the room clung to the air, and my heartbeat pounded in my chest, faster, harder, like it was trying to escape. My hands trembled as I reached up, feeling the cold metal of the helmet still strapped to my head. I tore it off in a panic, the click of the machine's monitor now silent. I sat up slowly, scanning the room. It was the same sterile white walls, the same bright fluorescent lights overhead. But something was wrong. The machines that had been hooked up to me, gone. The bed was empty. The IVs, the wires, the monitors that had tracked every breath and pulse, no longer present. I stood, my legs wobbly, like they hadn't carried me in years. Something gnawed at the back of my mind, a deep, unsettling feeling that refused to go away. Where was everyone? I could feel the panic rising, but I pushed it down. I stumbled out of the room, my vision blurry, as though I was seeing the world through a fog. The hallway stretched in front of me, but everything felt distant, muted. My head was pounding, but I wasn't sure if it was from the after effects of whatever they'd done or something else entirely. I squinted, trying to clear my vision, but the more I walked, the less clear everything became. The walls stretched longer, the hallway darker, as I stumbled forward, trying to find my bearings. I blinked rapidly, forcing my eyes to adjust to the overwhelming sense of wrongness. I couldn't place it. Was this the same facility? Was I still in the same place? Was I even me anymore? Then, in the distance, I saw him. A figure, standing still in the middle of the hallway, framed by the dim light at the end. A boy, maybe 13, maybe younger. He was small, thin. His clothes faded like they'd been worn for years. His head was down, his dark hair hanging over his face, so I couldn't see his eyes. He was just standing there facing away from me, completely still. The further I walked, the more questions popped into my mind. Who was this boy? Why was he here? Was he a part of the experiment too? I wanted to call out to him, to ask him what was going on, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. A strange unease had settled over me, heavier than anything I had ever felt before. It wasn't just confusion anymore. It was fear, fear of the unknown, fear of what I might have come back to. The boy stood there, like a shadow in the hallway, unmoving, and for a moment, I wondered if I was still dreaming, if I hadn't truly woken up at all. But the coldness in the air, the creaking of the building, the strange emptiness that surrounded me, it all felt so real. I took a hesitant step forward. The boy didn't move. Another step. He still didn't react. "Hey," I called, my voice rough, barely a whisper in the stillness. Nothing, not even a flicker, just silence. And yet, something in my gut told me I had to keep walking. Something told me that this boy was tied to it all. Something important, something I couldn't yet understand. I wasn't sure what I was walking toward, but at that moment, I knew one thing for certain. I may never turn back. The closer I got, the more details began to form around the boy. Details that were once blurry in the distance, but were now strikingly clear. He stood there facing away from me, his small frame almost unnaturally still. As I approached, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He was wearing tattered clothes, an old shirt, a pair of faded jeans, but there was an odd quality to them, like they were far too worn for someone his age. His shirt, a dull gray, had small tears at the edges, the fabric fraying at the sleeves. His sneakers, once white, were now stained with dirt and worn at the soles. His hair, dark and messy, hung over his forehead, barely covering his eyebrows. But it was his face that struck me the most. He looked older than he should. There was a wisdom in his eyes that I couldn't fully see because of the way his head hung low. But when I did catch a glimpse, they were far too old, too knowing for someone who seemed no older than 13. I stopped a few feet away from him. The silence in the hallway was suffocating, the stillness oppressive. It was like the air had thickened, becoming too heavy to breathe. There was no sound, no footsteps, no chatter, just the odd, unsettling quiet that seemed to press against my chest, making my heart beat faster with every breath I took. "Where is everyone?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, though it felt as if my words were swallowed by the emptiness around me. I looked around, expecting to see someone, anyone, but there was nothing, no sign of life anywhere. It was as though the whole world had stopped moving. Then, just as I reached out, I saw his head tilt up. His eyes, those deep ancient eyes, looked straight into mine, and I felt a cold chill run through me. And then, he spoke. "I am." His words pierced the silence like a thunderclap. The weight of them hit me all at once, and for a second I froze in place. "I am." Those words, simple yet profound, felt like an answer to a question I hadn't even realized I was asking. The question that had been gnawing at the back of my mind ever since the moment I had crossed over. The question about what was real, what was beyond life, what came after. Who was this boy? What was he, and why was he here? "Are you God?" The question spilled from my lips without thought. It felt like the right thing to ask. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I couldn't stop myself. I needed to know, needed some sort of confirmation about what was happening. The boy didn't blink, didn't move. He just stood there watching me with those impossibly old eyes. "I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I am that I am." His voice was calm, almost as if he were reciting a verse, something ancient, something written thousands of years ago. His words resonated in the stillness, echoing in the empty space around us, and yet they felt so utterly familiar. The words were from the Bible, a scripture I'd heard long ago, but hearing them now, in this moment, with this boy standing in front of me, it was like they were meant just for me. But why? Why was he here? What did it all mean? I stood there, frozen, unable to form another question. The boy's presence was overwhelming, suffocating, as if the weight of eternity was pressing down on me. Everything I thought I knew, everything I'd been through, everything I'd experienced, it all seemed insignificant compared to the magnitude of what stood before me. But even though I had no answers, I felt like I was standing on the edge of something beyond death, beyond the experiment, beyond everything. And this boy, this strange otherworldly figure, was the key. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Instead, all I could think was, why me? The boy stood there, his small form so strangely out of place in the emptiness of the hallway. There was an unsettling stillness in the air, and it was as if the very space around us was holding its breath. His eyes, ancient and knowing, never left mine, and as I stared back at him, a question burned in my mind. Why a child? Why did God appear to me as a young boy? But before I could even speak, his voice cut through the silence once more, as if he were reading my thoughts. You weren't supposed to be here, he said, his voice steady, but there was an underlying tremor, something in his tone that hinted at confusion, or perhaps something more. How are you here? I couldn't answer. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. My mind was racing, spinning with thoughts of the impossible reality unfolding in front of me. I was standing here, in a world that didn't seem to exist, talking to God in the form of a child. And somehow he knew what I was thinking. This is the form you recognize me as, he said, answering the silent question in my mind. This is how you see me. This is how you perceive me. I stared at him, completely dumbfounded. It felt as if I was standing in the presence of something far beyond my comprehension, and yet something about the way he spoke was so familiar, so hauntingly human. How did he know? I asked, why do you know the answers to the questions in my head? The boy didn't blink, didn't hesitate. He looked at me with those unfathomable eyes and answered in a voice that was both ancient and childlike. Sometimes I am omniscient, and sometimes I ain't. I stood there, speechless. How could I process this? Everything I had known about reality, about life, about God, it was all being dismantled in front of me, piece by piece. What was this place? What was happening? I finally managed to speak, my voice shaky. Why are you here? The boy's gaze darkened, and for a brief moment, I saw something in his eyes, a flicker of something ancient, something deeply troubling. His expression shifted, and the air around us seemed to thicken with a weight I couldn't explain. I am hiding, he said slowly, each word laced with a quiet sorrow that sent chills down my spine. I never died. I am still here, but I am hiding. Hiding? I echoed, my voice almost lost in the stillness. Hiding from who? He didn't hesitate, his voice low and grave. I am hiding from the creator of me. He wants to enslave me and other gods, even humanity. He wants control. He wants everything. And I hid this world from him. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, settling over me with an unnatural weight. My mind couldn't fully grasp what he was saying. Who was this creator? Why did he want to enslave gods and humanity? And why was this child, this boy, hiding from him? I swallowed, my throat dry. Who is this creator? What is his name? The boy's eyes flashed with a hint of something darker, something dangerous. His name is Samael, he said, his voice laced with a quiet venom. That is the name he goes by. Samael. The name echoed in my mind. Unfamiliar, but somehow important. There was a terrible finality in the way the boy said it, as though Samael's very name held power that could unravel everything. I took a step back, my head spinning. What was all of this? What had I stumbled into, and why was I part of it? The answers were beyond my understanding, beyond anything I could have imagined. Yet I was standing here, in this place, with this boy who spoke with the weight of eternity. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy, and for the first time since I awoke, I felt the true enormity of what was happening. I was no longer just part of an experiment, no longer just a man searching for answers. I had become entangled in something much larger, something that threatened to shatter everything I thought I knew. And in front of me stood a child. No, God, who was hiding from Samael, the creator, the one who wanted to control everything. I wasn't sure where I fit into this, but I knew with every fiber of my being that I couldn't leave. Not yet. Not until I understood what had truly happened, and what my role was in this cosmic battle between gods. The boy, this child who had called himself God, stood there before me, his eyes carrying the weight of unimaginable truth, and I felt a tremor of dread crawling up my spine. His next words hit me like a sudden thunderclap. Samael, he said slowly, is the one who created me. He created all the gods, even the ones you don't know about. But a god also created him. Everything has a start. It's like a domino effect. Once you knock it down, it never stops going until it reaches the end. And right now, there's a battle going on. A battle that no one knows about. No human knows about this. I stood frozen, unable to speak, my mind whirling, as I tried to process the magnitude of what he was saying. The very fabric of reality itself seemed to be unraveling before my eyes, and I was caught right in the middle of it, helpless. No, the first one I've told this to, the boy continued, his voice laced with a hint of urgency. You've been hiding here, waiting, until I saw you. You have to go back. You're not supposed to be here. You better run, because this god, Samael, created other beings, and these beings, it's not something you want to mess with. They destroyed heaven, they destroyed hell, and next, they might destroy this world. His words hung in the air like a cold, heavy weight, and my stomach twisted in fear. Destroyed heaven? Destroyed heaven? Destroyed heaven? How was any of this possible? And why was I the one hearing it? Why had I of all people been chosen to know this truth? I don't know how to get back, I whispered, my voice thick with confusion. I can't go back. I don't have the willpower to, and I don't even know how I ended up here. The boy's gaze softened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something resembling pity in his eyes. I can't do anything. If I were to help you, they would find out where I am. I can't use my powers. That's why I don't answer prayers anymore. That's why I don't show up. That's why humanity never sees me. Because I'm in hiding. I could feel the weight of his words pressing down on me. This child, this god, was hiding, not just from Samael, but from everything that existed. He was running from something so vast, so dangerous, that even his godly powers couldn't shield him. And now, I was caught in the middle of it all. Then what am I supposed to do? I asked, my voice shaking with the enormity of the situation. How can I go back? And what if it's too late? I can tell you, he replied, his tone heavy with regret. I can't even help you. But I can tell you this. The battle is already in motion. It's a fight for control over everything, even over you, over this world. And Samael isn't someone you want to cross. You need to get out of here. You have to go back before it's too late. The finality in his voice hit me like a jolt of electricity, and I stood there, overwhelmed, my mind spinning with questions I couldn't answer. This battle, this war between gods, was far bigger than anything I had ever imagined, and now I was tangled up in it, with no way to return to the life I had known. But the boy was right. I had to go back. Somehow, I had to find my way out of this place, away from whatever forces were at play, before Samael or these other gods found me. And as I turned to leave, my heart pounding in my chest, I could only wonder what would happen next, what kind of world I was returning to, and what role I would play in this cosmic struggle for power. Would I survive the battle? Would I even be able to escape? All I knew was that my life, as I knew it, was over, and I was stepping into a world that might never be the same again. The sudden sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, sharp and deliberate, sending a jolt of panic through me. My heart hammered in my chest, and before I could even react, the boy grabbed my arm, pulling me swiftly into one of the nearby rooms. We hid behind the door, breathless, as the footsteps grew louder. Shh, the boy whispered urgently, pressing his finger to his lips. His eyes were wide with fear, but there was something else in them too, an ancient knowing, a fear of the unknown that chilled me to my core. They're here. The air around us seemed to thicken, every nerve in my body on high alert. The footsteps were closer now, but something was wrong. They weren't the typical sounds of human feet. These were different, strange, uneven, almost like a mixture of humanoid and something else, something animalistic. I strained to hear, focusing on the peculiar rhythm of the steps. The sounds seemed to come in waves, like claws scraping against the floor, interspersed with a soft, almost guttural breathing. It was like nothing I had ever heard before. The steps were heavy, yet fluid, predatory yet calculated. The boy's grip tightened on my arm, his expression tense as he slowly crouched down, motioning for me to follow his lead. We knelt low, trying to make ourselves as small as possible in the dimly lit room. The door barely cracked open to allow us to see into the hallway. Then, through the sliver of light, I saw them. They were silhouettes at first, but as they moved closer, I could make out their features, twisted forms that seemed almost human but not quite. Their limbs were too long, their bodies unnaturally thin, with joints that bent in strange, unnatural ways. Their faces, if they could be called faces, were a grotesque blend of animal and something darker. Hollow, glowing eyes peered out from the shadows, scanning the hallway with an eerie, predatory awareness. I swallowed hard, barely able to breathe as they passed by, their movements so silent, yet so deliberate. Every step they took made the air feel heavier, charged with an unnatural energy. I could feel the boy beside me shaking slightly, his own fear palpable. What are they?" I whispered, my voice barely audible, as the creature's eyes flickered in our direction. "They're not supposed to be here," the boy said, his voice shaking slightly. "They're a byproduct of Samael's creations. They're his hunters. They'll find you if they sense you, and right now, they're hunting us." I watched, terrified, as the creatures continued down the hall. Their strange fluid movements were hypnotic, but they were nothing short of monstrous. As they passed the door, I could feel a cold, oppressive presence wash over me, like the very air had become thicker, darker. One of them paused, its head tilting slightly, as if sensing something in the room. My breath hitched in my throat, and I instinctively held my own breath, praying it wouldn't hear me. Its glowing eyes scanned the room, its lips curling back in what almost looked like a smile, a horrific, predatory smile. The boy tugged at my arm again, pulling me further back into the shadows, his eyes wide with desperation. "Stay quiet. Don't move." I nodded, my entire body stiff with fear, as I tried to remain as still as possible. The creature's gaze lingered for a moment longer, and then thankfully, it moved on, continuing down the hallway with the others. I let out a slow, shaky breath, my heart still racing in my chest. What the hell were those things? "Monsters," the boy replied, his voice tight. "Samael created them to hunt down anyone who gets too close to the truth, and right now, that's us." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a strange mix of sorrow and determination. "We need to move. They're going to keep looking until they find us, and when they do, there will be no escaping." The door slammed open with a violent force, splinters of wood flying across the room as the creatures poured in. There was no warning, no sound to announce their arrival beyond the deafening crash. They moved in, silent and eerie, their long, twisted limbs scraping against the floor, their eyes glowing like embers in the dark. These creatures were even more grotesque up close. Their bodies were long and thin, with unnaturally long arms and legs that seemed to bend at the wrong angles. Their skin was pale and stretched, almost translucent, like something that had been marred by time and decay. Jagged, sharp claws extended from their fingers, and their faces were the stuff of nightmares, twisted amalgamations of human features and animalistic traits. Hollow, cavernous eyes stared out, glowing with a sickly yellow light, their mouths full of sharp, uneven teeth, grinning like predators watching their prey. Their bodies were slick with something dark and viscous, and the scent that filled the room was rancid, like blood and decay, the stench of something ancient and wrong. Their movements were jerky but deliberate, as though they had all the time in the world to catch their prey. One of them, its head too large for its body, turned toward the boy and me with a slow, deliberate motion, its grin widening as it took a step forward, its tongue slithering from its mouth like a serpent. The boy's grip on my arm tightened. "We need to go, now." But before we could react, God grabbed my arm, his touch firm, and suddenly, without any warning, the world around us bent and twisted, the air around us warping like a liquid. In an instant, we were no longer in the dark, sterile hallway. We were in a vast, cavernous room, filled with a heavy silence that pressed down on me from all sides. It looked like heaven, at least, what I imagined heaven would look like, but something was terribly wrong. The golden light that should have filled the space was dim, flickering like a dying flame. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and the entire realm felt like it had been abandoned, left to rot. The throne room was vast, stretching endlessly in every direction. The walls seemed to pulse with an eerie, soft glow, and the floor was made of smooth white stone, covered in patches of what looked like blood, angelic blood. Bodies littered the ground, their forms twisted and broken, wings torn and broken at the base, feathers scattered like ash across the cold stone. There were no signs of life, no movement, not a single whisper of sound, just an overwhelming emptiness. In the center of the room stood an empty throne, its seat barren, untouched. It was magnificent, made of the purest gold, encrusted with precious gems that shimmered faintly in the dim light. But there was no one sitting there. The absence was suffocating. I turned to God, my voice shaky with the overwhelming sense of horror that gripped me. Where is everyone? Where are the humans when they die? If there is no heaven, then where? God's gaze softened, but there was a deep sadness in his eyes as he looked at me. They get reincarnated, he said quietly. Sent back to Earth. They are protected for now. They don't stay here. Not anymore. I took in the bodies around us, the empty throne, and the endless empty space. Why? Why is it like this? Because Samael, he said, his voice low and filled with pain, and his creations. They destroyed heaven, destroyed everything. His eyes darkened as he looked at me. And they're looking for you. Every second, you're with me. You're a beacon, a signal, a threat. I shuddered, my mind racing with confusion and fear. What do you mean? Why would I be a beacon? You're the first person to know the truth, God said, his voice heavy with the weight of ancient knowledge. You're not supposed to be here. You've seen what shouldn't be seen, and that makes you dangerous. To them. I looked at the empty throne once more, the silence overwhelming. Heaven. This place was no longer a sanctuary. It was a graveyard, and I had stumbled into it. They'll come for you, God continued, his gaze distant, focused on something unseen. They'll come for both of us. I can't protect you here. Not for long. And then it hit me, the full weight of what I had just learned. The world I thought I understood, the one I thought had been destroyed, was still out there, but it was nothing like I had imagined. The truth was far darker than I could have ever imagined, and now I was trapped in the middle of it all, with no way to turn back. I asked another question, the one that had been gnawing at me for so long. Where is Satan in all of this? God paused, his expression darkening as if the mere mention of his name brought an unsettling weight to the air. He was taken by Samael, God said, his voice filled with a sadness I couldn't quite understand. He took my son, and I've never seen him again. I don't talk about it much. Please, stop asking more questions about him. Suddenly, God's tone shifted. He seemed to gather himself, his gaze piercing. It's been a pleasure meeting you, he said, almost reluctantly. But you have to go back now. I will send you back. They already know I'm here because of you. You cannot tell anyone what really happened. You must lie. No one needs to know the truth. Only you get to know it. I want a witness. I needed a witness. And you will forever carry this memory with you, no matter how many reincarnations you experience. It doesn't matter if you're a bug, an ant, or a human being. You will always be able to remember what just occurred. Before he could finish, a burst of light erupted from nowhere, blinding and overwhelming. Creatures, demonic and otherworldly, poured from the light, their forms distorted and unnaturally twisted. Fear clenched my chest as I tried to comprehend what was happening. God's grip tightened around my arm, and his voice cracked through the chaos like thunder. Go. His command shook me to the core, and everything around me warped and distorted, as if reality itself were tearing apart. In an instant, I was pulled back, as if being sucked through an endless tunnel of light, and everything went white. I opened my eyes to a world that was not mine, but was unmistakably familiar. At first, everything was a blur. My surroundings were indistinct, moving like smudges in the periphery of my vision. I could barely make sense of what was happening. My body felt like it was still suspended in the void. Every part of me felt disconnected from myself. I tried to move, but it was like my body was trapped in molasses, slow and uncooperative. My hands trembled as I reached out, desperate for some kind of anchor in this strange returning reality. Gradually, the blur started to clear, and I could see my hospital room. My body lay in that sterile, cold bed, machines around me quietly humming. The world outside the room seemed muted, distant. My mind screamed that something was wrong, that I shouldn't be here. My eyes flitted around, trying to make sense of the fragmented images before me. Everything was too still, too quiet. The hum of the machines felt out of place, almost foreign. My vision was sharp, but my body remained heavy, like it didn't quite belong to me anymore. Then, the realization hit me. I was alive again, but that knowledge didn't fill me with relief. It felt wrong. The sudden weight of it was unbearable. I had come back, but there was a cold, uneasy emptiness around me. The air felt too still. The silence was too thick. It was as if the world had forgotten how to breathe. I felt the words rise in my throat, but they were choked back, trapped within me. What had just happened? What was the truth? The question that had haunted humanity for centuries echoed in my mind. Unbidden, what happens after death? I didn't have to think long before the answer formed, and my voice, now steady, though it felt foreign, spoke the truth that had been thrust upon me. Reincarnation, I murmured, the word tasting bitter in my mouth. We get reincarnated after death. That's what I learned. The eerie stillness in the room deepened. It felt as if the walls themselves were listening. I knew the truth now. I knew what God had been hiding. I had seen God, and I had seen what he was hiding from. The endless, dangerous creatures from the other side of existence. I had seen the battle, the war between gods, between Samael and the ones who created us all. I had learned that everything we know is a lie, that death is not the end, but only another cycle. And the truth about Satan, his disappearance, was a secret buried too deep for anyone to know. And now, I was the witness. I would carry this knowledge forever, no matter how many times I was reborn. The truth was carved into my very being. I saw God, and he is hiding. I know the truth now, and there's only a matter of time before they come for us. The Dollmaker. The coastal fog had swallowed Harborview whole by the time Claire Martin's car crossed the town limits. Her headlights carved weak tunnels through the dense mist as she navigated streets that felt both familiar and foreign after 15 years away. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sheriff Thomas Reeves. Body found, Town Square Garden. It's bad, Claire. Shit, she muttered, changing direction toward the center of town. Shed returned to Harborview 2 days ago when 8-year-old Emily Preston disappeared from the Harvest Fair. Not because small-town police couldn't handle a missing child case, but because something about it had pulled at a thread inside her that had been loose for 15 years. The same thread that had unraveled when her 9-year-old sister Olivia vanished without a trace. Claire parked behind the police barricade and stepped into the fog. Thomas stood in the garden, his broad shoulders hunched against the cold. The years had added lines around his eyes and silver to his temples, but his posture was exactly as she remembered from high school. "Thanks for coming," he said, his voice gruff. "Fair warning, this is nothing like anything we've seen before." He led her around a hedge to a small clearing. In front of a stone bird bath, posed in a perfect arabesque, stood what Claire first mistook for a child's mannequin, until she got closer. Emily Preston's body balanced on one leg, the other extended behind her, arms gracefully curved above her head. She wore her Harvest Fair dress, but her skin had been painted stark porcelain white. Her eyes had been removed and replaced with glass replicas, blue and shining in the beam of police flashlights. "What the hell?" Claire whispered, crouching beside the body. "That's not even the worst part," Thomas said. "The child's organs have been removed," explained Dr. Eliza Morgan, the county medical examiner. "The cavity has been packed with straw, sawdust, and fabric scraps." "Like a doll," Claire said. Claire circled the body slowly. "Any message from the killer?" Thomas pointed to the bird bath. Crude letters were carved into the stone. "She dances forever now." Claire noticed something glinting in the grass beneath the bird bath, a shard of porcelain, curved like a piece of broken doll's face. The Prestons sat in Thomas' office. James hunched forward while Linda stared straight ahead, her posture rigid. "Mr. and Mrs. Preston," Claire began gently, "I need to ask you some questions." Did she suffer?" James asked, his voice cracking. "We're still determining that," Claire said carefully. "Who would do this to a little girl?" James asked, his voice rising. Who the fuck could do something like this? Did Emily have any particular interest in dolls? Claire asked. Linda's eyes snapped to Claire's. Why would you ask that? The positioning of her body, Claire explained. It was deliberate, like a posed doll. She loved ballet, Linda said. She was taking lessons. Were there any adults who took a special interest in Emily? Linda shifted slightly. There was that old woman at the fair. The one with the herb shop. She kept watching Emily, tried to give her some kind of charm bracelet. Miriam Wilson? Thomas asked. Linda nodded. Emily said the woman told her it would keep the shadows away. One last question. Claire said, was anything missing from Emily's room after she disappeared? Her ballerina music box, Linda said. I didn't notice until now, but it's gone. Miriam Wilson's shop smelled of dried herbs and something sharper. Candles flickered in the windows despite the morning hour. You're the detective, she said when Claire entered. The one who lost her sister. Claire stiffened. How did you know about my sister? Everyone knows everyone's business in Harborview, especially the tragic stories. I'm here about Emily Preston. The first doll, Miriam said. Claire's hand instinctively moved toward her holstered gun. What did you just say? You heard me. She won't be the last. It's starting again. What's starting again? Sit down, detective. The shadows were already gathering around her. What shadows? Miriam set a mug of tea on the counter. The ones that wear familiar faces. The Dollmaker doesn't have a face of its own. It wears ours. The Dollmaker. That's what it's been called for over 100 years, since William Baker lost his daughter and tried to bring her back. Tell me about William Baker. He was a toy maker, made beautiful dolls. When his daughter died of fever, he went mad with grief, started making dolls that looked exactly like her. Then children started disappearing. When they were found, they'd been turned into life-size dolls. That's just a story. Check the town records from 1872, Miriam said. Then tell me it's just a story. It'll come for another child soon, she continued. And when it does, look to those closest to your heart. The shadow hides in grief. She fixed Claire with an intense stare. Your sister, you never found her, did you? Claire left without answering. Outside, the fog had thickened. For a moment she thought she saw a small figure watching her from across the street. A child with long dark hair like Olivia's. But when she blinked, there was nothing there. In the town archive, Claire found a series of articles from 1872 about missing children. 3 children had disappeared, and their bodies were later discovered altered in a grotesque manner, resembling oversized dolls. The final article mentioned the toymaker's workshop burning down, with dozens of dolls, all bearing a striking resemblance to Baker's deceased daughter found in the ruins. Claire photographed the articles and headed back to the station, where Thomas showed her another porcelain fragment found at the garden. This isn't new, she said. Look at the weathering. This has been in the ground for years. Her phone buzzed with a text. Another girl missing. Sophia Baker, age 7. Last seen walking home from school. Fuck, she whispered. It's happening again. Claire stood in 7-year-old Sophia Baker's bedroom, taking in the rows of dolls that lined the shelves. Antique porcelain dolls with painted faces and glassy eyes stared back at her. She collects them, Mrs. Baker explained. Her grandmother started giving them to her when she was 3. When did you notice she was missing? She should have been home from school by 4. It's only 3 blocks. Everyone knows everyone here. Except someone in Harborview was taking children, and no one knew who it was. Outside, Thomas was organizing search parties. Mayor Gregory Walsh arrived, putting pressure on them to solve the case quickly, more concerned about the town's tourism than the children. We're exploring several angles, Claire told him vaguely. Well, explore them faster, Walsh said. The fall festival season is our economic lifeblood. With all due respect, Mr. Mayor, Claire interrupted. 2 children are missing or dead. The festival season shouldn't be our priority. While reviewing security footage around Sophia's disappearance, Officer Reynolds discovered something disturbing on the gas station camera. There, he said, pointing at the screen. At 3:51. The angle captured Sophia stopping at the corner of Pine and Main to speak with someone. The child nodded, then followed the person down Pine Street. Reynolds pulled up additional footage from a hardware store camera with a better angle. Claire could see Sophia walking hand in hand with a woman down Pine Street, a woman with Claire's build, hair and jacket. When Reynolds enhanced the image, Claire felt the blood drain from her face. "What the fuck?" she whispered. "That's not possible. I was here at 3:51 yesterday." Thomas stared at the screen, then at Claire. That can't be you." "I was with you," Claire insisted. The shadows were familiar faces. Miriam Wilson's words echoed in her mind. "I need to speak with Miriam Wilson again," Claire said. The herb shop was closed, a handwritten "back soon" sign hanging in the window. Claire found the door unlocked. "Miriam," she called, stepping inside. The shop was dark, the candles unlit. A soft thump came from the back room. Claire drew her weapon and pushed aside the beaded curtain. On the floor near the window, Miriam Wilson lay on her back, arms wrapped around a large porcelain doll. Her eye sockets were empty, bloody hollows. The doll in Miriam's arms had a painted china face, its blue glass eyes eerily similar to those placed in Emily Preston's sockets. Claire called it in, then searched the room. On a small desk, she found a journal open to a page filled with Miriam's handwriting. "It's happening again. The Dollmaker has returned. I tried to warn her, but she doesn't understand yet. It hides in grief, wears the skin of those who've lost the most. The toys are the key. It always takes a toy first, then the child." "We found fibers on her clothing," Dr. Morgan told Claire later. "Dark wool, consistent with your jacket, Detective Martin." Claire stared at her. "I never touched her." The thought came unbidden. What if I did it, and don't remember? That night, Claire dreamed of Olivia. They were in their childhood bedroom, surrounded by Olivia's doll collection. In the dream, Olivia's face was porcelain white, her eyes glass. "You let him take me," Dream Olivia said, her voice unnatural. "Now he's taking them all." Claire woke gasping, dawn light filtering through her motel room curtains. For a moment she thought she saw a small figure standing in the corner of the room, but when she turned on the lamp, nothing was there. She showered and dressed quickly, determined to find answers. At the town's historical society, she discovered disturbing details about William Baker that hadn't made it into the newspapers. Baker's daughter, Elizabeth, had died of scarlet fever in 1871. Consumed by grief, he'd discovered an ancient ritual in a book of occult practices that promised to preserve a soul. His journals described how grief itself could become a conduit. "The hollowness inside me calls to something older than time." Baker had written about finding a way to house Elizabeth's spirit in a perfect vessel by transferring innocence from one child to another. He believed the eyes were crucial, windows through which the soul might return. Her phone rang. It was Thomas. They found Sophia Baker. The second doll was discovered in the old cemetery, posed kneeling beside a weathered gravestone, like Emily. Sophia had been transformed, her skin painted white, glass eyes inserted, organs removed and replaced with stuffing. Her hair had been replaced with yellow yarn, and a fixed smile painted on her lips. Carved into the gravestone were the words "Mother and child reunited at last." "The grave belongs to Elizabeth Baker and her mother," Officer Reynolds told Claire. As the crime scene unit worked, Claire noticed Mayor Walsh watching from behind the police tape. "This is getting out of hand, Detective," he said. "People are talking about leaving town until the killer is caught." "I'm doing everything I can," Claire replied. "Are you? Because from what I hear, you're chasing ghost stories." As he walked away, Claire noticed something glinting in the grass, another porcelain fragment, similar to those found with Emily. "Thomas," she called. "These fragments are being left deliberately." "Claire, you need to be careful," he warned. "People are starting to talk about you. The video, the fibers on Miriam's body. Mayor Walsh has been asking questions about your whereabouts." William Baker's land lay on the outskirts of town. The workshop had burned down in 1872, but a small cottage on the property had survived. Reynolds parked at the end of a dirt track, and they continued on foot through dense underbrush. The cottage, when they found it, was little more than a stone foundation and crumbling walls. In what had once been the cellar, Claire found a trapdoor hidden beneath years of dirt and debris. The space below was small but intact. Shelves lined the walls holding dozens of porcelain doll parts, heads, limbs, torsos, In the center stood a workbench covered in dust. Claire approached the bench carefully. On it lay an ancient leather-bound book and a wooden box containing locks of hair, baby teeth, tiny fingernail clippings, mementos of Elizabeth Baker, preserved by her grieving father. The book contained technical notes on doll making, but toward the back, the writing changed. I have found the way to bring her back. The ancient text speaks of a spirit that can move between vessels, seeking the warmth of the living. It requires a sacrifice, grief for grief, child for child. I have made my offering. Soon Elizabeth will dance again. Detective, Reynolds called from across the room. You need to see this. He was standing before a wooden cabinet. When Claire joined him, she saw a small porcelain doll dressed in a blue dress, identical to the one Olivia had been wearing when she disappeared 15 years ago. Claire reached for the doll, but as her fingers touched it, a stabbing pain shot through her head. The room spun, and for a moment she thought she saw a small girl standing in the corner. Not Olivia, but Elizabeth Baker, her face cracked porcelain, her eyes empty sockets. You're next, a voice whispered in her mind. You've always been mine. Then darkness claimed her. Claire woke in a hospital bed, Thomas sitting beside her. What happened? She asked, her throat dry. You collapsed in Baker's cellar, he said. Reynolds called an ambulance. You've been unconscious for 6 hours. The doll, the journal. Evidence techs have collected everything, Thomas assured her. But Claire, we need to talk. He held up his phone, showing her a video clip. The footage showed Claire entering Sophia Baker's house through a back window, then leaving 30 minutes later. That's not possible, Claire whispered. I was with you. Not the whole time, Thomas said gently. You left to get coffee, remember? There's a 20-minute gap I can't account for. We found Sophia's ballerina music box in your motel room, he continued, and Emily Preston's music box too. Someone planted them. Claire's mind raced. Someone's framing me. Or you're having blackouts, Thomas suggested. Maybe related to the trauma of your sister's disappearance. You think I'm killing these children, turning them into dolls? Jesus, Thomas, I don't want to believe it, he said. But the evidence, fuck the evidence. Something is happening in this town. Something that's happened before. The same thing that took Olivia. Thomas stood, his expression pained. I've asked Dr. Morgan to do a psychological evaluation. Until then, I'm placing you under observation. As he left, Claire noticed her reflection in the darkened window beside her bed. For a split second, she thought she saw someone else looking back, a face like hers, but with glassy, lifeless eyes. 3 days under observation had frayed Claire's nerves to breaking point. An officer was stationed outside her hospital room at all times, and she wasn't permitted to leave. Officer Reynolds visited daily, smuggling in case files and updates. It was Reynolds who told her they'd found William Baker's journal in her motel room, a journal shed never taken from the cellar. Someone's setting you up, he whispered. But why? Because I'm getting too close to the truth, Claire said. Reynolds, I need your help. I need to see the dolls from Baker's cellar. He returned that evening with a flash drive. Photos of everything, he said. And I found something strange on one of the doll heads. He pulled up an image on his tablet. It showed a porcelain doll head with a jagged crack across its face, identical to the fragments found at both crime scenes. The lab confirmed it, Reynolds said. The pieces you found came from this doll, but the break patterns show the pieces were broken off recently, not 150 years ago. Someone has access to Baker's original dolls, Claire murmured. There's something else. Reynolds swiped to another image. A doll with Olivia's face, identical down to the small mole near her left eyebrow. Claire felt her heart stop. That's my sister. I know. The resemblance is uncanny. Not resemblance, Claire corrected, her voice hollow. It is her. Someone made that doll to look exactly like Olivia. What if your sister wasn't the first? What if whatever's happening now was happening then too? I need to get out of here, Claire said suddenly. Tonight. The storm hit Harborview just after 11 p.m. Sheets of rain lashing the hospital windows as lightning split the sky. By midnight, when Reynolds triggered the fire alarm in another wing, the storm had reached its peak. Claire slipped out during the chaos, using the emergency exit Reynolds had left unlocked. Her first stop was her motel room, where she retrieved her gun and notes from a hidden go bag. As lightning illuminated the room, Claire caught a glimpse of a small figure reflected in the mirror. When she looked back, for a split second she saw herself with porcelain white skin and glass eyes before the image returned to normal. Her next destination was Baker's cellar. The storm had made the dirt track to the property almost impassable. Claire abandoned the car halfway and continued on foot, rain plastering her hair to her face. The cellar entrance stood open, crime scene tape fluttering in the wind. Claire descended the stairs, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Evidence markers still dotted the space, but most items had been removed. What remained were the dolls deemed irrelevant to the case, dozens of them, staring with glass eyes from shelves and tabletops. Claire searched until she found it, a small porcelain doll with auburn hair, Olivia's hair. Claire reached for it with trembling hands. The moment her fingers touched the cool porcelain, pain lanced through her head. Images flashed before her eyes. Olivia walking into these woods 15 years ago, following a figure that looked like Claire. Olivia lying on the workbench, her eyes removed. Olivia's body transformed into a doll. Claire gasped, dropping the doll. It shattered on the stone floor, the head breaking into pieces. From within the broken porcelain, something rolled out. Claire picked it up and nearly retched. It was a child's eye, preserved somehow, the iris still a recognizable hazel. Olivia's eye. No, Claire moaned, falling to her knees. No, no, no. The eye should have decomposed years ago, yet it remained intact, preserved by whatever dark magic had transformed her sister. Baker's journal had mentioned windows to the soul being essential to the ritual. The entity needed these eyes as anchors, tethering it to our world through stolen innocence. You weren't supposed to find that yet. Claire's head snapped up. In the doorway stood Linda Preston, her clothes drenched from the rain, her eyes reflecting the beam of Claire's dropped flashlight. Linda? Claire scrambled to her feet, reaching for her gun. What are you doing here? The same thing you are, Linda said, her voice oddly calm, looking for answers. Did you follow me? Linda smiled, but the expression didn't reach her eyes. I've been following you since you arrived in Harborview, Claire. Or should I say, I've been following myself. Claire's finger tensed on the trigger. What are you talking about? Linda's form seemed to shimmer in the flashlight beam. Well, I've worn many faces over the years. The grieving mother, the concerned teacher, the detective haunted by her past. Her smile widened unnaturally. I know how to use grief, how to wear it like a second skin. Understanding dawned, cold and terrible. You're the Dollmaker. Not exactly, Linda said, stepping closer. The Dollmaker was William Baker. I am what he invited in, the entity that granted his wish to preserve his daughter forever, and I've been collecting perfect vessels ever since. The children, Claire whispered. You've been taking them for 150 years. Not continuously. I sleep between cycles, awakening when grief calls to me. Your grief called very loudly. Claire Martin. Why children? Claire's gun hand trembled slightly. Why not just take adults? Children are purer vessels. Their innocence makes them perfect for transformation. Linda's head tilted at an unnatural angle. Adults I merely borrow, like poor Linda here, but only the most profound grief creates enough hollow space for me to enter. Grief for a child works best. It carves out the perfect void. Claire raised her gun. Stay back. Linda laughed, the sound echoing unnaturally in the cellar. You can shoot me without shooting Linda Preston, and she's innocent in all this. Just another vessel, like you've been. What do you mean, like I've been? Why do you think there's footage of you taking Sophia? Why your fingerprints were on Miriam's body? I've been wearing your skin since you arrived, slipping in and out while you sleep. Claire felt sick. You took Olivia. You made me think I'd failed to protect her. I made you perfect, Linda corrected, grief hollowed and ready to house me. I've been patient, waiting for you to return, and now the cycle is nearly complete. Lightning flashed, illuminating Linda's face. For a moment her features seemed to melt, revealing something else beneath, a porcelain mask over empty darkness. Claire fired. The bullet struck Linda in the shoulder, spinning her around. She stumbled, but didn't fall, and when she turned back, her expression had changed completely. Claire, or Linda's voice was different now, confused, frightened. What's happening? Why am I here? Oh God. You shot me. Claire hesitated, her gun still raised. Linda, listen to me. Something is using you, controlling you. You need to fight it. Linda pressed her hand to her bleeding shoulder, her eyes wide with pain and confusion. I don't understand. The last thing I remember is being at home with James. Then, nothing. The entity that's been taking children, it's possessing you. It's been possessing me too. Thunder crashed overhead, and Linda's body convulsed. When she looked up again, her eyes had changed, flat and glassy. Poor Linda, the thing wearing her face said, how grief made her such an easy vessel. Just like your grief made you easy. It lunged suddenly, inhumanly fast. Claire fired again, but the bullet seemed to have no effect. Cold hands closed around her throat, driving her backward into the shelves. Dolls crashed down around them, as Claire struggled for breath. I'm going to wear you forever, the entity hissed. Your guilt over Olivia makes you perfect. Through darkening vision, Claire saw the truth. Her guilt had been feeding this thing for 15 years. Her grief over Olivia had created the opening it needed. With her remaining strength, Claire reached for the fallen flashlight and swung it hard against Linda's head. The woman crumpled, and Claire gasped for air. Claire's gaze fell on Baker's ritual components and journal pages, describing how the binding might be undone. The binding requires grief. The unbinding requires acceptance. Linda stirred, her body moving jerkily as she rose to her feet. Blood streamed from the wound in her shoulder, but she seemed not to notice it. You can fight me, the entity said through Linda's mouth. I am grief incarnate. I know, Claire said, backing toward the workbench. And I've carried my grief for too long. She grabbed the candles from Baker's box, lighting them quickly. The storm howled above as Claire arranged the candles in a circle around herself. What are you doing? The entity demanded. Letting go, Claire said. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to face the memory shed, then running from for 15 years. Olivia walking into the woods, following a figure that looked like Claire. Claire, 15 years old, frozen in terror, unable to call out or follow. I'm sorry, Olivia, she whispered. I was just a kid. I couldn't have saved you. The entity shrieked, a sound like breaking glass. Stop, Claire continued, tears streaming down her face. I forgive myself. I release my guilt. Linda's body convulsed, her back arching unnaturally. Something seemed to be trying to escape from inside her, a shadowy form pulling away from her human shape. I accept what happened, Claire said, her voice stronger now. I couldn't save you then, but I can stop this now. The entity tore free from Linda, who collapsed to the ground, unconscious but breathing. For a moment it hung in the air, a shifting darkness with the suggestion of a porcelain face, its empty eye sockets fixed on Claire. You can't unmake what's been done, it hissed. The dolls remain, but they don't control me anymore, Claire replied. And I understand what you are now. Not a demon or ghost, but grief itself given form, fed by our pain until you became real. The entity rippled, its darkness thinning. Each eye I take sees only me. Each heart I empty fills with me. This cycle will continue as long as there is loss. She picked up a fragment of the broken doll that had contained Olivia's eye. With steady hands, she placed it in the center of the candle circle and set it alight. The entity screamed, its form rippling as flames consumed the porcelain. Cracks appeared across its face-like surface, spreading rapidly. Light blazed from within the fractures, growing brighter until Claire had to shield her eyes. When she looked again, the entity was gone. The dolls on the remaining shelves had crumbled to dust, and Linda Preston lay unconscious but alive. Outside, the storm had passed. 1 week later, Claire stood in the town cemetery. 2 small graves had been added, Emily Preston and Sophia Baker, but Claire's attention was on the newest memorial, a small stone for Olivia Martin, finally laid to rest. Thomas joined her, his face solemn. The Emmy confirmed that the eye belonged to your sister. I'm sorry, Claire. What will happen to Linda? Claire asked. Psychiatric evaluation, but she's not being charged. The evidence shows she was not herself. None of this will make it into the official report, you know, about the entity, Baker's ritual. Some stories are better left untold. But remembered, Claire insisted. So it doesn't happen again. Do you think it's really gone? Claire thought of the entity's final words. There will always be dolls. I don't know, but I think our grief gave it power. By facing that grief, we weaken it. They stood in silence for a moment before Thomas spoke again. Are you sure you won't stay? The department could use someone like you. Claire shook her head. There are other missing children, other cases to solve. But I'll visit. As Thomas walked back to his cruiser, Claire knelt to place flowers on Olivia's memorial. For the first time in 15 years, when she thought of her sister, she remembered her smile rather than her absence. In a city 200 miles away, a young girl browsed a flea market with her mother. At a table of antique toys, something caught her eye. A porcelain doll with a painted face and glass eyes. Can I have this one, Mom? Please? I don't know, honey. It looks old and kind of creepy. The girl picked it up anyway, cradling it in her arms. As her mother turned to examine another table, the doll's eyes slowly blinked. Don't worry, the girl whispered to the doll. He'll take you home. The Crucifixion of Jesus. We work for a company, a secret government facility called Braxis. For years we've pushed the limits of time travel, bending the laws of physics to our will. But one thing we've never done is crack the code to travel further back, farther than a few hundred years. That changes today. Doctor? Adrian Voss stands over the console, hands hovering over the controls, his breath shallow. The room is tense, the glow of the reactor casting sharp shadows against the steel walls. This is it, he mutters. This is where we break history. I glance at the others. Dr. Langley double-checks the calculations on his tablet, jaw clenched. Ramirez wipes the sweat from his brow. Agent Calloway, always composed, just watches. Adrian's finger hovers over the activation switch. A single press, and we go where no one has ever gone. Further back. To the very moment that could change everything. The crucifixion of Jesus Christ. That's where we were going. The machine, the chrono rift, was a monstrosity of steel and circuitry, a coffin-shaped chamber built for three. Its surface pulsed with streaks of blue energy, the reinforced glass of the entry hatch trembling as the core spun beneath it. Cables snaked across the floor, feeding into a reactor that thrummed like a living thing. Inside, 3 harnessed seats faced a curved control panel lined with flickering displays, biometric scanners, and a fail-safe switch we prayed we'd never need. I was going in, along with Adrian Voss and Dr. Elaine Carter. Adrian was the lead physicist, the genius who had spent the last decade tearing apart the laws of time. He was sharp, meticulous, but there was something in his eyes, an obsession that made me uneasy. Elaine was our historical analyst, chosen for her extensive knowledge of ancient civilizations and religious texts. Unlike Adrian, she was cautious, always second-guessing, always grounding us in reality. Then me? I was the observer, the one sent to record history firsthand, the one who would see the truth with my own eyes. I gripped the harness straps as Adrian powered up the rift. The chamber vibrated, the walls groaning under the pressure of forces we barely understood. A deep hum filled the air, a sound that wasn't just noise but something deeper, something that rattled the bones. Last chance to back out, Adrian said, his fingers tightening over the activation panel. Elaine shot me a look, her face pale. I could see the doubt there, the unspoken question, should we be doing this? I swallowed hard. Do it. Adrian pressed the switch. The world fractured. The machine spoke, its synthesized voice cold and emotionless. Destination confirmed. April 3rd, 33 AD, Jerusalem, preparing for temporal displacement. The year scientists believed to be the most probable date of the crucifixion, the moment everything changed. The reactor roared beneath us, the air inside the chrono rift growing thick, charged with something beyond electricity. The reinforced glass flickered between reality and something else, something raw and unfinished. Elaine gripped the armrests, her knuckles white. Adrian's breathing was steady, but I could see the tension in his jaw. Initiating time breach in 3, 2, 1. The world shattered. The machine groaned, its steel frame shuddering violently. I felt my body jerk in every direction, like a ragdoll caught in a storm. The walls of the chamber blurred, twisting and rippling, as though the fabric of space itself was coming undone. My stomach flipped in a way that made me want to scream, but no sound came, just the disorienting rush of windless pressure pressing against my chest. I couldn't tell which way was up. The lights in the rift flickered, sputtered, then blinked out completely. All I could hear was the thundering pulse of the reactor beneath us, a heartbeat louder than my own. My hands gripped the armrests, knuckles white, but I could feel the air around me tearing apart. Time, reality, everything was falling, spinning, stretching. And then, a sudden brutal stillness. It was like being slammed against an invisible wall, but instead of pain, there was only the suffocating quiet that followed. The violent shaking stopped as abruptly as it had started. For a second, I couldn't move. Everything felt like it had frozen in place, but the sensation was too intense, too alien for me to comprehend. I blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of what had happened. My head spun, my body heavy and unresponsive. When I lifted my hand to adjust my jacket, I froze. The fabric, the stitching, it was all wrong. I wore a plain black hoodie, faded jeans, and sneakers that felt out of place against the coarse air. Adrian had on, as usual, a black t-shirt with a faded logo, cargo pants and boots that looked too modern to belong here. Elaine's jacket, sleek and tight, seemed to mock the time we'd just stepped into. We didn't belong. The air had a dry, biting heat to it. I could taste dust in the back of my throat as the wind kicked up around us. The ground beneath our feet a hard, uneven surface of cracked earth and jagged stones. Ahead of us, sprawled in the distance, was a city. The city, Jerusalem, as we'd been told. But it was no modern city, no towering buildings or glistening glass structures. The walls were jagged and sun-bleached, rising from the dust like an ancient ruin. Stone towers stood tall, their surfaces eroded by time and the endless harsh winds. From here, I could see the squat, flat-roofed buildings crowding the streets, packed so closely together that they looked like a maze of stone, winding and labyrinthine. The streets between the buildings were narrow, choked with dust, and littered with dried hay and refuse. The people moved in slow, deliberate steps, their feet shuffling over the ground in sandals that seemed to be molded directly to the earth beneath them. The women wore simple tunics, their heads covered by scarves, while the men wore plain robes, their faces weathered by the relentless sun. A distant bell tolled somewhere in the city, a low, mournful sound that echoed through the still air. The sun hung high, unforgiving, casting long shadows across the cracked streets, and yet the city seemed alive with the buzz of everyday life, unhurried, patient, as if the world had never changed. And still we didn't belong. We were standing in a place that was centuries behind us, our clothes an insult to the world around us. The city was ancient, its stones weathered, yet everything inside it felt as if it had been frozen in time. It was as if we had stepped into the past, but not just any past. A past that was sacred, a past that would soon witness something that would shake the very foundations of faith itself. And that was why we had come. But now that we were here, the weight of it, the wrongness of being here, settled into the pit of my stomach. We began the long walk down toward the city. Miles stretched between us and the walls of Jerusalem, but the heat, the oppressive air, made every step feel longer. The ground beneath our feet was cracked and dry, the dirt swirling with dust as we moved. Every so often, I caught a glimpse of our reflection in the darkened windows of makeshift homes. Our modern clothes, so out of place, stood stark against the earth-toned simplicity of the world around us. The others, Adrian, Elaine, and I, we were like ghosts in a world that had no need for us. As we neared the outskirts, it didn't take long for the first eyes to fall on us. They were cautious glances at first, quick flicks of the gaze, but then they lingered. People stopped their work, paused in their tracks, staring at us as we walked past. A child tugged at his mother's robe, whispering something I couldn't catch. She glanced at us and quickly pulled him close, her brow furrowing, as if she feared something might infect him just by looking at us. A man adjusting a wooden cart turned slowly, eyes widening as he took us in, his lips curling into a mix of confusion and concern. He muttered something to a companion who stood nearby, and before long the whispers began, quiet at first but growing louder, rippling through the street like a wave. Elaine, ever the cautious one, pulled her jacket tighter around her, trying to shrink into herself, as though somehow she could become invisible. Adrian's eyes flicked over the people, but he didn't flinch. If anything, He stood a little taller, like the attention didn't faze him. But me? I felt every eye, every glance that seemed to pierce through my skin, past the modern fabric and straight into something they couldn't understand. It was like we were a spectacle, something they had never seen before, and they didn't know whether to fear us or marvel at us. A woman with a basket of fruit stood just ahead, her face wrinkled with age. She squinted at us, her gaze lingering on the smooth synthetic material of our clothes, then down at our shoes, her lips parting in disbelief. The strange foreign look on her face was clear. What are you? I could feel the weight of it all. This unnatural feeling that clung to us. I felt like a freak show, something designed for their amazement, their confusion. Another man, this one older with a beard streaked with gray, walked up to us, cautious but intrigued. You, where are you from? His voice was rough, the words foreign and halting, but it was the question we feared. Adrian didn't answer at first, his lips pressed into a thin line. Elaine spoke before he could, her voice quiet but firm. We were travelers, she said. The man didn't seem satisfied, his brows knitting together. He looked us up and down again, scanning our clothes, the slickness of the fabric that didn't belong to this time. Travelers, he repeated, as if tasting the word, trying to decide if it made sense. A murmur rippled through the crowd. As we walked deeper into the city, more eyes followed us. A group of children stopped playing with stones, their bare feet frozen against the dirt as they stared. A man in a robe paused by a door, leaning out to take in the strange figures who had dared to walk through his world. They didn't know what to make of us, and neither did I. We didn't belong here, and the longer we stayed, the clearer it became. The bell rang, loud and ominous, echoing through the streets with a sharp, resonant clang. It was a heavy sound, one that made the air itself seem to still, as if the world was bracing for something. People stopped what they were doing, their eyes rising toward the sound, then quickly lowering as they began to move, almost instinctively. It was like a signal, a command. We didn't know why, but something pulled us forward. The crowd, quiet, solemn, but united, began to flow like a river, all of them heading in the same direction. People shuffled along, their bare feet moving quickly through the dust, their heads bowed. A few whispers passed, but no one spoke above a murmur. I glanced at Adrian, then Elaine, both of them already walking along with the crowd, their expressions unreadable, as if this had become their path too. I had no choice but to follow, and so I did, my feet moving of their own accord. The streets became narrower as we pushed past the buildings. The sounds of the city faded into the distance, replaced by the soft shuffle of sandals on dirt and the occasional gasp from the crowd. We were leaving the city, heading toward the outskirts, toward the far reaches of the land. The dust grew thicker, the air heavier, as if the weight of the moment was pressing down on us with every step. And then, as we crested a small hill, I saw them. A group of Roman soldiers, strong men, their armor shining despite the dust, their faces hard and indifferent, lined the road ahead. They moved with purpose, but not with haste. In their midst, dragging a heavy wooden cross, was a man. At first, I didn't recognize him. His body was bent, as if the weight of the cross was too much for him to bear. His head hung low, his hair matted with sweat, his skin bloodied and torn from lashes. His legs trembled with each step, but still he pulled the cross behind him, the splintering wood scraping the ground with each agonizing drag. The soldiers, their faces cold and unfeeling, followed behind him, cracking whips at his back, at his legs, at the ground around him. Every crack of the whip was like a shout, a vicious command that he was to keep moving. The sound of the leather against his skin made my stomach turn. He stumbled, collapsing to the ground beneath the weight of the cross. But before he could even catch his breath, the soldiers yanked him up by the arms, their grip cruel. One of them kicked the cross, forcing him to rise and continue dragging it forward, the blood from his wounds staining the earth beneath him. I could feel the heat rising from the land, from the crowd that had followed like obedient sheep. We had come here, to this desolate stretch of earth, to witness this moment, this brutal, painful moment. The man was no longer just a figure in a book or a story I had heard since childhood. He was real, flesh and bone. His suffering was not just a tale passed down through time. It was here, in front of me, raw and terrifying. The crowd pressed in closer, the tension thickening as we all watched the procession. The sky was dimming, as if the heavens themselves were waiting, holding their breath for what was to come. And I realized, as I stood there, frozen in place with the rest of them, that we weren't just witnesses to history. We were intruders in something that had no place for us. This was a moment, the moment that we had no right to observe, no right to interfere with. But we had come, and now there was no turning back. The hill was barren, a desolate patch of land that had been worn down by countless souls who had passed before. The dry earth cracked and split beneath the weight of history. There, two wooden crosses stood against the sky, looming like dark sentinels waiting for their prey. One was in place, standing tall and ready for its condemned. The other, the one meant for the man in the middle, lay on the ground, waiting to be hoisted. The soldiers, no longer just keeping pace but urging their prisoner forward, marched him to the hill. His steps were slow, almost dragging, like the very weight of his fate had already broken him. His shoulders hunched beneath the immense burden of the cross, his back a mess of raw, bleeding gashes from the lashes he had received. He stumbled as he walked, his body trembling with exhaustion, but the soldiers' harsh words and whips drove him onward. And then, the moment came. He collapsed. The heavy cross slipped from his shoulder and hit the ground with a dull thud. He crumpled beneath it, his knees giving way. His breath was ragged, his chest heaving for air. The crowd shifted, murmuring in uneasy whispers. I could feel the tension in the air, thick like fog. Suddenly, Adrian's voice cut through my thoughts, his hand grasping my arm, pulling me back. Don't do it, he warned, his voice tight with fear. We can't. We shouldn't. Elaine, too, looked at me with wide eyes, panic flickering in her gaze. This isn't our place. This is history. You can't change it. You. But the words felt distant, swallowed by the sheer weight of what I was seeing. The man, the one who was about to be executed, lay there on the ground, his breath shallow and desperate, as the soldiers prodded him with their sharp spears. They moved like shadows, indifferent to his suffering. The cruelty of it all made my stomach churn, but something deep within me stirred. I couldn't just stand by. Ignoring their protests, my feet moved before I could even think to stop them. My hands trembled as I knelt beside the fallen man, the sight of his battered body striking me to my core. The rough wood of the cross was heavy in my hands, but I lifted it, gritting my teeth against the weight, trying to steady myself. Let me help, I found myself saying, the words slipping out before I could even process them. The soldiers didn't stop me. They didn't even seem to notice, caught up in their own cruel task. Together, we raised the cross, his bloodied hands brushing against mine. I lifted it with every ounce of strength I had, my heart pounding in my chest as I helped him stand. I caught a glimpse of his face, his eyes locking with mine, and I froze. He looked exactly like the pictures. His hair, long, dark, and matted with sweat, fell in tangled strands across his forehead. His beard was unkempt, but it didn't hide the sorrow in his expression, nor the quiet strength that emanated from him. His eyes, those eyes, weren't just blue, they burned like fire, a fierce intensity that seemed to pierce through me, to see all my fears, my doubts, my sins. He didn't speak, his lips barely parted, but in the silence between us, something passed, something ancient, something that made the world seem insignificant. And then I noticed his feet, bloodied, battered, scraped raw. The soles were cracked, torn, but they seemed to press into the earth with the force of something far greater, something that belonged to the heavens and the earth all at once. His feet were like diamonds, not in the literal sense, but in the way they seemed to endure the weight of something more than the physical pain. His body was breaking, but there was something in him that refused to bow to it. A low hum of sorrow and power seemed to emanate from him as he stood there, leaning slightly against the cross. His breath came in short gasps, but his gaze never faltered, never wavered. "Are you all right?" I whispered, though I knew he couldn't answer. His lips parted slightly, and for a moment it seemed like he might speak, but he didn't. He only nodded, a slow, painful movement, acknowledging me without words, and somehow that made it worse. The crowd was still watching. We were all watching. I wasn't supposed to be here. None of us were. The gravity of the moment hit me like a tidal wave. This was history, the real history, but somehow with the cross between us. In this moment, we were connected. Adrian and Elaine stood a few paces away, their eyes wide, helpless. Adrian's mouth was a thin line, but he didn't say anything more. It was too late for that. I glanced back at the hill. The soldiers were already moving, preparing to raise the cross for its final place. And somehow, I knew this moment was one that couldn't be undone. And so together, this man and I, and the cross, we walked. The hill loomed ahead, the sky darkening, the air thick with the weight of what was to come. The soldiers led the way, but it was me, it was us, who carried the weight of this moment forward. As we walked closer to the hill, the air seemed to thicken, the weight of the moment growing heavier with every step. The dry, cracked earth beneath our feet suddenly felt different, warmer, almost suffocating. And then, a low rumble, distant at first, broke the heavy silence. It sounded like thunder, but it wasn't just any thunder. It was deep, rolling through the sky, almost like the earth itself was groaning under the weight of what was about to happen. I glanced up, squinting against the growing darkness. The sky, once a pale, washed-out blue, was now swirling with clouds, thick and heavy, gathering together in a way that felt unnatural. They churned like a storm had risen from nowhere, blocking out the sun. The heat of the day began to retreat, replaced by an almost unnatural chill, the air turning damp and thick with tension. Elaine's voice trembled as she muttered, her eyes darting nervously. This isn't right. Adrian, always the more rational one, turned his head to look at the sky, his brow furrowing. It's just a storm, probably just a coincidence. But there was no mistaking it. The clouds weren't just gathering, they were closing in. They moved in a way that seemed deliberate, as if they had a purpose, as if they were waiting for something. The wind began to whip around us, picking up in intensity, tearing at our clothes. The sound of the approaching storm was deafening, a low, steady roar that seemed to reverberate through my bones. And as we walked, the thunder grew louder, more pronounced, as if it were reacting to every step we took. The rumble of it filled the air, echoing across the hill. It was like the sky itself was warning us, like it knew what was coming. Jesus, barely able to stand under the weight of the cross, stumbled again, but his eyes never strayed from the hill ahead. Despite everything, despite the pain and the exhaustion, there was something in his gaze, something deep, something unyielding. He was walking to his fate, the storm gathering behind him like an omen, a silent witness to what was about to happen. As we neared the summit of the hill, the rumble of the thunder became a constant, the clouds thickening above us, turning darker by the second. The first flash of lightning split the sky with a crack so sharp it rattled my teeth, and I flinched, instinctively pulling back. The earth seemed to tremble beneath our feet, as if it were ready to crack open at any moment. And still, we walked on. The soldiers too seemed to feel it. They paused, glancing upward with narrowed eyes, but their focus never shifted. They were more concerned with getting Jesus to the top of the hill than the storm. The moment wasn't about the weather. It was about what was going to happen next. We reached the top of the hill, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing at the very edge of something vast and incomprehensible. A violent wind howled around us, pulling at our clothes and hair, but still, Jesus kept his gaze fixed ahead, as if the storm were no more than a distant hum. The soldiers began their grim task, positioning the cross, their hands quick and mechanical, almost like they had done it countless times before. The storm seemed to reach its peak just as they began to raise the cross, the wind whipping furiously around us. A flash of lightning tore through the sky again, and the sound of the thunder was deafening. It felt like the heavens themselves were screaming. I couldn't look away. I couldn't tear my eyes from Jesus. His body was stretched, nailed to the cross, and as the soldiers lifted it, his head bowed, the weight of the world pulling him down. The clouds swirled above us in a violent frenzy, the thunder now an unrelenting roar, echoing through the valley. The earth seemed to groan beneath us, and for a moment it felt like everything around us had gone silent, like time itself was holding its breath. Then, as if on cue, the sky shattered. The thunder crashed, and the storm seemed to unleash in full force, the clouds turning a deep, bruised purple, swirling in a chaotic, unnatural dance. The first raindrops fell, cold and heavy, and they landed on my skin like ice. The storm didn't just feel like a storm. It felt like a warning. Something was happening. Something was unfolding that I couldn't fully understand, but I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. The storm wasn't just a natural occurrence. It felt personal. And in that moment, standing beneath the weight of history, beneath the raw intensity of the storm, I realized that this wasn't just a man on a cross. This wasn't just an execution. This was something that would shake the very foundations of the world. The hill was barren, empty save for the soldiers, the few onlookers who dared to watch, and us, the strangers from the future. The weight of the moment pressed down on me like an iron vise, suffocating, overwhelming. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, its rhythm in sync with the sudden stillness in the air. They raised the cross, its wooden frame groaning as it creaked against the ropes, and then the soldiers began their brutal task. Jesus was forced to his knees before the cross, his body trembling. One of the soldiers grabbed his wrist and drove a large iron nail into his hand with a sickening crack. The sound reverberated through the air, and I could taste the iron in my mouth, the foulness of it settling deep in my throat. He screamed. It was a scream that tore through the air, raw and unearthly. His body shook with the force of it, but the agony didn't end. The soldiers moved quickly, nailing his other hand to the wood, and the blood, hot and thick, poured from the wound, dripping down, staining the ground below. Jesus writhed, his chest heaving with each tortured breath, but still, he remained silent through it all, his eyes locked on the sky, as though searching for something, or maybe just waiting. They nailed his feet next, stacking them one on top of the other in a strange position. I could see the look of agony on his face as the nail was driven through the flesh, the blood pouring down in streams. The soldiers didn't care, didn't pause, just kept working mechanically, their hands steady and cold as they secured him to the cross. And then, with a final tug, they hoisted the cross into the air, the rope creaking as it held the weight. The sky seemed to grow heavier, the clouds swirling above us, angry and thick, but still, Jesus hung there, suspended in the air, his body slumped, his chest rising and falling with each agonizing breath. And that's when he spoke. "I am Satan." The words broke through the air like a thunderclap. A chill ran down my spine, and I swear, the wind itself seemed to stop for a moment. The world seemed to hold its breath. The soldiers stiffened, their expressions uncertain, but no one dared move. Jesus' voice was weak, but there was something powerful in the words that followed. "I am dying for the sins of humanity," he continued, his voice hoarse. "I am convincing God to spare the world. I may hate all of you, but you mortals have potential. And if God doesn't want you anymore, then I will have all of you. So I will die for your sins, and your children's sins." I could hardly breathe. I had no words. The sky felt darker, and the earth beneath us trembled with the weight of what was unfolding. The others, Elaine, Adrian, stood frozen, their faces pale, their eyes wide in disbelief. Jesus' gaze shifted then, turning to the sky, his lips parted, and with the last remnants of his strength, he spoke again. O Father, why have you forsaken me?" The wind howled, a mournful cry that carried his words like a prayer, like a plea to the heavens. His eyes drifted to the two men beside him, hanging on their own crosses. They too were in pain, but the difference in their suffering was stark. Jesus, though racked with agony, still held a strange kind of peace in his eyes, a calmness that seemed to radiate from his very being. His words then fell upon them. "Worry not. I will protect you. You're coming with me to a new heaven, a better heaven." I didn't know what to say, how to react. Every fiber of my being felt frozen, locked in a moment I couldn't fully comprehend. The sky above us was thick with clouds, and I could feel the weight of what he had said, the intensity of the storm, the crackle in the air. There was something ancient in his eyes, something eternal, and for the briefest of moments, I could almost hear the rumbles of the earth beneath us, responding to his words. The rain began to fall again, heavy, cold drops hitting the earth like the world itself was weeping. I didn't know if I believed him. I didn't know what any of this meant. But as Jesus' body hung there bloodied and broken, I couldn't help but feel the gravity of it, the weight of what he had said. And for the first time, I wondered if we, the ones who had come to see it all, were the ones who had truly misjudged everything. The storm raged on above us, and the sky cracked with lightning. But the words Jesus spoke lingered in my mind like an echo that would never fade. "Worry not, I will protect you all." I step forward, my heart racing in my chest, my mind a mess of confusion. My hand trembles as I reach out, pressing it against the rough, splintered wood of the cross, the pain radiating from Jesus' broken body, the agony hanging heavy in the air. It all feels suffocating, like the world itself is holding its breath. The storm rages above, the wind whipping through the air, and I can take my eyes off the figure on the cross. I swallow, my throat dry, and finally I speak. My voice cracks, thick with emotion. "Are you really the devil? Is this why they crucified you? What are you really? How are you Satan, but not Jesus? I'm confused. Please, answer me. Do not go yet. I still have questions." The world goes silent, save for the soft, steady rhythm of the rain, like time itself is holding its breath. Then from the cross, I see it, a faint smile. It's not a smile of joy, but of something else. A strange, knowing smile, tinged with sadness and understanding, like this was all inevitable. "I am Satan," the figure on the cross says, his voice barely a whisper, but it carries a weight that presses down on me like the storm above us. I am able to shapeshift into many beings. I am many things. I am a dragon, a snake. I am Jesus. I am even God. I am what I want to be, and what I prefer humanity to see me as. The words hit me like a blow, sinking deep into my chest, leaving me paralyzed. Everything I thought I knew about Jesus, about Satan, about God, everything feels shattered in that moment. The figure on the cross, his body bloodied and broken, still carries a strange calmness in his eyes. It's as if he's at peace, despite the excruciating pain he's enduring. The storm rages, but all I can focus on is his words, words that seem to bend the very fabric of reality itself. My mind struggles to comprehend it all, the weight of it pressing down on me. My thoughts scatter, trying to make sense of what I just heard. I open my mouth, but the words come out shaky, uncertain. "You are everything, and nothing." What does that mean? How can you be all of them? How can you be both Satan and Jesus? The figure on the cross just watches me, his gaze piercing through me, like he can see every question, every ounce of confusion in my soul. But he doesn't answer, not in this moment, not with words. His silence, it says everything. It says the answer may never come, not in this world, not in this time. The storm rages on, its fury intensifying as the rain pelts down harder and harder, drenching us all. The wind howls, and I feel the weight of it, the weight of everything that just happened. I stand there, my hands still pressed against the cross, trying to understand, trying to make sense of what I've just witnessed. Elaine and Adrian approach, their footsteps muffled by the storm. One of them places a hand on my shoulder, a gesture of comfort, of understanding. They feel it too, the confusion, the disbelief, the weight of the truth we just learned. It's too much, too overwhelming, but somehow, we're not alone in it. They feel the same, and for a moment, there's solace in that. I swallow hard, my voice shaky, as I ask one last question. Satan, one last question. Where is Jesus? If you aren't him, is there even a real Jesus? Was there ever a Jesus? Satan, his body broken and bloodied, looks down at me with that same strange, knowing smile. It's the kind of smile that sends a chill down your spine. His words come slowly, carefully, like he's been waiting for this moment, waiting for me to ask. "There is no Jesus," he says softly, his voice cold and calm. "It's always just been me. I made it all up. The birth, the star in the sky, it's all on me. You know, when my father gave me the earth, he wasn't kidding. This earth is mine, and I make it in my image. God may have made you humans in his image, but I have reshaped you all in ours." The last sentence strikes me like a bolt of lightning, like the truth of the world itself being laid bare in a single terrifying declaration. And then, just like that, he dies. The body on the cross slumps, lifeless, the last breath leaving him in an eerie silence. As if in response, the heavens break open. Lightning strikes the ground with a deafening crack of thunder, and the rain pours down in torrents. The wind whips around us with a strength I've never felt before, as if the world itself is mourning the death of something much bigger than just a man on a cross. And yet, despite the storm, There is something unsettlingly still about the moment. It's as if time itself is caught between the past and the future, unsure of where it belongs. We stand there for a while, not knowing what to do, not knowing what to say. Some people, those who had been watching, turn away, indifferent. After all, he had claimed to be the devil. They don't care much about his death. But for others, like his mother, the loss is overwhelming. She cries, her sobs loud in the storm. A mother mourning her child, a child who had said things that shook the very foundations of the world. I understand now. That's why we weren't taught this part of history. Some things are just meant to be left in the dark. The truth, in all its rawness, is too much to bear, too dangerous. We begin to walk away from the cross, the storm still raging around us. Our steps are heavy, burdened with the knowledge we carry, with the truth we now know. We make our way toward the coffin-like machines, the ones that will take us back to our time, back to our reality. The wind howls, the rain beats against us, but we don't stop. We can't stop. As we enter the machines, I take one last look at the storm outside. The world seems different now, changed, as if the very fabric of history has been ripped apart, revealing the truth beneath. And as the machines hum to life, taking us back to where we came from, the weight of it all settles in. I know the truth now. The truth about the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And it's all built on lies. The Memory Eater. In the depths of rural Appalachia, where the misty dawn kissed the decaying hills, there stood an ancient twisted tree. Its bark was etched with symbols that seemed to writhe like living serpents. The locals avoided the tree, whispering tales of an abomination that dwelled within. They called it the Memory Eater. Rumors spoke of a creature that fed on the recollections of those who dared approach. It was said that the Memory Eater could consume the very fabric of one's mind, leaving behind a hollow shell of forgotten dreams and lost loves. Dr. Emma Taylor, a renowned psychologist, had always been fascinated by the human brain's mysteries. She saw the Memory Eater as the ultimate case study, an opportunity to unravel the enigma of memory and identity. Emma packed her bags, bid farewell to her skeptical colleagues, and embarked on a journey to find the twisted tree. As she delved deeper into the heart of Appalachia, the air grew thick with an unsettling bitter scent, like burning pine or resin. On a dreary autumn evening, Emma finally stumbled upon the tree. Its branches seemed to reach out, like skeletal fingers, beckoning her closer. As she approached, the symbols on the trunk began to glow with a faint, ethereal light. A low, raspy voice whispered her name. Emma spun around, but there was no one in sight. The voice seemed to emanate from within the tree itself. "Who are you?" Emma called out, her voice trembling. The Memory Eater's awakening was marked by a haunting, ethereal sigh. The wind responded, rustling the leaves with another worldly language. Forgotten memories swirled to life, their whispers weaving a poignant tapestry. The carefree laughter of childhood, the sweet nothings of lovers, and the lulling refrains of a mother's love. With a deep breath, Emma steeled herself and reached out to touch the glowing symbols. Her hand quivered, betraying her trepidation, but her curiosity propelled her forward. As soon as her skin made contact, the world around her began to dissolve. Memories flooded her mind, not her own, but those of the countless individuals who had approached the tree before. Emma saw a young couple's first kiss, a soldier's final goodbye, a child's birthday party. The memories were vivid, yet fragmented, like shattered glass. The Memory Eater's voice whispered in her ear, "Forget." Emma's mind recoiled in horror as she realized the true nature of the creature. It didn't just consume memories, it devoured identities. As the memories continued to flood her mind, Emma felt her sense of self slipping away. She was no longer a psychologist, a daughter, a friend. She was a vessel for the forgotten recollections of others. The last thing Emma remembered was the taste of her own name, fading like ash on her tongue. When the locals found her, she was catatonic, her eyes vacant, her mind a hollow shell. They whispered that the Memory Eater had claimed another victim, leaving behind a fragile, forgotten thing. The twisted tree remained, waiting for its next victim, its branches etched with the symbols of forgotten lives. A Watcher in the Green. Chapter 1. The Leash. Ace watched me from the corner of the room with those wide, expectant eyes that dogs reserve only for moments that actually matter. Not for treats, not for squeaky toys, not for dropped food. This was the look he gave me when he knew something needed to change. The leash hung by the door like a noose of guilt. It had been weeks, maybe longer. I couldn't remember the last real walk we took, just bathroom breaks and backyards. The kind of lazy neglect you don't think about until you suddenly do. He never complained. Dogs don't. He just waited, always patient, always ready. I grabbed the leash, and his tail went into overdrive, smacking against the wall with hollow thuds like a heartbeat speeding up for the first time in years. "I owe you a good one," I said aloud, more to myself than to him. He didn't need promises. He just needed now. We loaded into the car and started the drive. 30 minutes of empty highway and 2-lane roads winding through suburban edges into something greener. The sky was too clear. The kind of empty blue that makes you feel like something is waiting just above it, out of sight. The sun shone, but the warmth didn't make it into the car. Ace had his head out the window, wind slapping his jowls, his mouth curled into a wild grin. I almost smiled back. Almost. I didn't think about anything, not my inbox. Not the text from my mom I hadn't replied to, not the half-finished projects, or the unopened mail piling up on the kitchen counter. For once, it was just me and Ace, and I tried to let that be enough. We pulled into the trailhead lot, just dirt and gravel with a single weathered sign that simply read Winridge Trailhead. No trail map, no warnings, no other cars. Ace jumped out before I could even clip the leash on. I let him roam. He never ran far. Not really. He just liked the feeling of space. The trees here were tall. Not just tall, taller than they should have been, reaching high into the sky like they were trying to block out heaven. Their trunks were thick with moss that didn't seem quite green enough. The kind of color you only see in dreams or decay. I hesitated at the trail's entrance. It looked like any other path at first. Dirt, leaves, roots snaking through the soil. But there was a stillness to it. Not quiet. Quiet is peaceful. This was silence, like the forest was waiting for me to speak first. I looked down at Ace. He looked back up at me and gave a small wag of his tail, just once, like a nod. So, we stepped into the woods, and the world closed behind us. Chapter 2. The Trailhead. The trail wound forward like a vein through the woods, pulsing with something unseen. I didn't notice it at first. Not the quiet, not the way the path narrowed behind us, like it was being swallowed up the moment we passed. Ace trotted ahead, tail high, head low, nose twitching at every shift in the air. He moved like he'd been here before, like he already knew where the turns led. I envied that certainty, his purpose built into his body. No hesitation, no overthinking, just motion. The air felt thicker the deeper we went. Not humid, not warm, just dense, like walking into a room where someone had been crying. It clung to my skin. I started to notice how empty it all was. No birds, no bugs, not even the usual rustle of something small darting into the brush, just the sound of our footsteps and the occasional snap of a twig under Ace's paws. It was the kind of silence that pushes into your ears until it becomes a sound in itself, a droning, high-pitched pressure that made me grind my teeth without meaning to. I checked my phone. No service. Not surprising. But there was no time, either. No clock. Just a black bar where the numbers should be. I stared at it longer than I should. Like maybe if I focused hard enough, it would blink back to life and remind me the world was still real. It didn't. Ace let out a single bark. Not loud, just enough to pull my eyes away. He stood a few feet ahead, tail stiff, ears forward, staring into a dense patch of trees just off the path. I followed his gaze but saw nothing. No movement, no glow, just trees, still, watching. I stepped toward him, and he turned back like he was waiting for permission to keep going. I gave a nod. He moved forward without another sound. The trail sloped downward now. Gentle at first. The kind of slope you don't notice until your knees start to ache. The sun, once overhead, now filtered through the branches like light through dirty glass. Pale, flickering. It felt less like afternoon, and more like a dream pretending to be it. There was a fork in the trail up ahead. Left curved upward slightly. Right dipped into darker growth. No signs. No footprints. No hint of which was correct. I hesitated. Ace didn't. He turned right. And I followed. Because that's what I do. I follow him. When I don't know what else to do, when I don't trust myself to choose, I follow Ace, and he's never led me wrong. But the further we walked, the less the forest felt like a place, and more like a decision. Chapter 3. The Wrong Forest. The path narrowed, then widened, then seemed to vanish entirely before reappearing behind a fallen log. Ace stayed ahead, nose low, tail still, focused. The trees were wrong. Not obviously. Not in a way you could explain to someone else, but wrong in that uncanny deep bone way. They were too tall now, too straight, too symmetrical, like they'd grown by design instead of nature. Their bark didn't flake or peel. It folded, like skin. I tried to shake it off. Told myself it was just the unfamiliarity, a trail I'd never walked. But something about the ground felt off too. The dirt was dark and too soft. No rocks, no gravel, no prints other than our own. Even when I stepped hard, nothing left a mark. The woods no longer smelled like woods. I hadn't noticed until then, but the scent of pine, moss, bark, damp leaves, it was just gone, replaced by something faintly sterile, like a hospital corridor after hours, clean, lifeless, hollow. I checked for the sun and couldn't find it. The light was still there, barely, but it didn't come from anywhere. It just existed, thin and gray and sour, like the memory of sunlight filtered through dirty water. The shadows didn't fall in one direction. They shifted when I wasn't looking. I turned back. The trail behind us was still there, but different. The trees we'd passed didn't look the same. One leaned now, cracked near the base like it had been struck. Another was missing its top entirely. I could have sworn they weren't like that before. Ace, I called. He stopped up ahead and looked back. No fear, no hesitation. Just that same calm gaze he always gave me when I was the one falling apart. There was something comforting in that, something grounding. I took a breath and caught up with him. We walked in silence for what could have been 10 minutes or 10 hours. The woods grew deeper, thicker. The sky above narrowed to a jagged strip, barely wide enough to call a sky. The trees leaned inward, watching, not malicious, not angry, just aware. And then I saw the first trail marker, a bright red square painted on a tree trunk. I hadn't seen one since we entered. I hadn't realized that until now, but this one felt new. Wet paint, dripping slightly, and beneath it, etched into the bark, a crude symbol, 3 interlocking circles with a single line slicing through them. Ace sniffed the base of the tree, but didn't linger. He moved on without a sound. I stared at the symbol for a long time before I followed. I didn't know why, but it felt familiar. Not from this life, but from something. We hadn't turned off the trail, but the forest we were in now was not the one we'd entered. And somewhere deep in my chest, I knew this wasn't a hike anymore. We weren't walking a trail. We were being guided down a path. Chapter 4. The Crooked Tree. The path curved left around a cluster of dense undergrowth, and that's when I saw it. The tree. It leaned at an angle that felt impossible, bent forward, its trunk twisted like it had tried to stand straight, but gave up halfway through. The branches stretched low, curling like fingers reaching toward the dirt. The bark was smooth in some places, flayed in others, revealing a pale underlayer that looked too much like skin. Says didn't approach it. He stopped in the middle of the path and sat, just sat, like he'd been told to wait. He didn't bark, didn't whine. He just watched me. The tree was in the middle of the trail. I'd have to step around it. As I got closer, I felt it. Not wind, not warmth, not cold. Just presence, like I was walking into a room where someone had been standing too close for too long. The kind of feeling that wraps around your spine and waits for you to speak first. I reached out. I don't know why. My hand stopped just short of the bark, and in that stillness, I heard it. Not with my ears, with something deeper, like it had bypassed sound entirely and slipped directly into my thoughts. Why did you stop trying? I flinched. The voice wasn't angry. It was tired, heavy, familiar, in a way that made my stomach turn. "Trying what?" I asked, my voice brittle and too loud in the silence. "To be what you said you'd become. To become what you were meant to be. You saw the road and sat down in the middle of it." My mouth was dry. I tried to laugh, but it stuck in my throat like a splinter. "You're just a tree." The bark shifted. Not moved, shifted. Like something just beneath it flexed. "We wear what we must to be heard. You needed a mirror. This is what your shape of failure looks like." The guilt hit like a cold wave down my spine. I looked back at Ace. He hadn't moved. Still watching. Still waiting. Still unbothered. I turned back to the tree. "I never meant to stop. Intention is irrelevant. You stopped." I took a shaky step back. My fingers trembled. The bark split slightly, like a mouth opening to taste the air. And for a moment the whole tree breathed. Then the feeling passed. Ace stood, shook his fur like he was brushing off dust, and walked past the crooked tree without a glance. I followed, slower, glancing back one last time. It looked like just a tree again. Still crooked, still wrong, but silent. And somehow the silence felt worse. Chapter 5. The Stone That Watches. The path bent downhill, carving through dense brush that clawed at my arms like it wanted to keep a piece of me. The ground turned harder here, the soil thinning until it gave way to packed earth and scattered stones. The air felt still but heavy, like being inside a room where someone had just left and took the light with them. That's when I saw it. The stone. It sat just off the trail, half buried in a shallow patch of grass. Round, flat, about the size of a dinner plate. Nothing extraordinary, but I couldn't stop looking at it. It was too smooth, too perfect. Its shape didn't belong here, not in a place where time was supposed to grind everything down. The moss around it refused to grow over the surface. The grass bent away from it, like it didn't want to touch. Ace stopped beside me, then turned and sat, facing the stone, not barking, not growling, just still. I stepped closer. It didn't move, didn't hum or glow or whisper, but the second I stood over it, I knew this wasn't a rock, not really. It was a presence pretending to be one, watching. I crouched and reached out, but didn't touch it, not yet. I could feel something rising behind my eyes. Not fear, not anger, something quieter, something older. Regret, so much regret. And then, like a dream folding into itself, the stone spoke, not in sound, not even in thought like the tree had, but through memory. My memory. I was 8 years old holding a sketchbook in my lap, telling my mom I wanted to design video games when I grew up. I was 16, talking about moving away, about starting over somewhere no one knew me. I was 23, lying to someone I loved about how everything was fine, because I couldn't admit I had no idea what I was doing. Each one hit like a heartbeat, slow, heavy, aching. I hadn't failed because I tried and lost. I had failed because I stood still. And I realized something, crouched there in the dirt, watching myself through the eyes of a stone. The forest didn't punish me for what I did. It punished me for what I didn't. I didn't move, didn't fight, didn't run. I just let life keep happening, and told myself that was the same as living. I stood. The stone didn't react. Ace rose too, but he kept his distance. His eyes were fixed on me now, not curious, not scared, just waiting. I turned and walked away. I didn't look back. Some part of me knew that if I did, I'd see more than a stone. I'd see a version of myself still sitting there, staring back. Chapter 6. The Hollow Sky. We climbed. The trail rose gradually, winding around hills too smooth to be natural. The incline wasn't steep, but my legs ached anyway, like the weight of everything I'd carried through life had finally sunk into my bones. Ace led, still silent, still steady, the kind of focus that made me feel like he knew where this was going, even if I didn't. The trees thinned as we climbed. Sunlight, if that's what it still was, filtered through in longer beams. Now, but it didn't feel warm, just brighter, almost clinical. A white light that highlighted imperfections instead of hiding them. Then the canopy broke. We stepped into an open ridge. A narrow clearing surrounded by skeletal trees whose branches reached out like ribs curling toward the sky. And I looked up. That's when it hit me. The sky wasn't sky. It stretched too far, too deep. Not upward, but inward, like I was looking into a dome made of memories. My memories, flattened and warped to fit a ceiling I never agreed to stand under. Clouds swirled overhead in slow motion, but they weren't clouds. They were faces. Some I recognized instantly. My father, a friend I ghosted in college, the barista I saw every day but never thanked, the professor who told me I had something special that I never followed up on. Others were less clear, half-familiar shapes that tickled some deep, neglected part of my brain. People I forgot, people I ignored, people I only ever existed near. They didn't move. They just stared, expressionless, watching. Not angry, not disappointed. Worse than that, indifferent. I looked down, trying to shake it off. But the pressure stayed, not on my body, on my sense of self, like being measured by something that didn't care if I was good or bad, just whether I had been anything at all. Ace stood beside me, looking up too. But he wasn't reacting. His ears didn't twitch, his posture didn't change. He just blinked once and sat in the grass like none of it was real. Maybe to him it wasn't. I turned in a slow circle. The sky followed. No sun, no moon, just that endless film of flattened faces, watching from the other side of something I couldn't name. I sat down. I didn't mean to. My legs just gave out. And I whispered, "I'm sorry." I didn't know who I was apologizing to. Maybe it was everyone. Maybe it was no one. Maybe it was me. Ace pressed against my side. Just leaned there. Solid. Real. Unaffected. After a while, I stood. The sky didn't change. The faces didn't blink. But I felt something give some invisible notch in the trail clicking forward, like I'd passed a checkpoint I didn't know existed. We kept walking, and I didn't look up again. Chapter 7. The Squirrel Prophet. The forest closed in again. After the sky, it was almost a relief, being wrapped in bark and shadow instead of stretched across 1,000 silent faces. The trail dipped and weaved like it was indecisive, unsure whether it wanted to keep going or just give up and disappear. The light shifted again. It was warmer this time, more natural. But that only made it worse. Something about the return to normalcy didn't feel earned. It was like walking back into a room where something awful had just happened, but no one would admit it. The kind of peace that feels wrong. Ace trotted ahead, his tail high again. He sniffed at a fallen branch, padded around a muddy patch, then froze, just for a second. I followed his gaze. A squirrel sat on a low branch up ahead. Nothing unusual. Small, brown, a little scruffy. It looked right at us, eyes wide, body perfectly still. Ace didn't move. Neither did the squirrel. A watcher in the green. Then, without warning, it stood on its hind legs. Not like an animal. Like a person. It blinked slowly, and something inside me dropped. Its eyes weren't animal eyes anymore. They were human. Brown. Bloodshot. Rimmed in red. I knew those eyes. I'd seen them in the mirror on my worst mornings. Then it spoke. Clear as a bell. "You were meant for more." That's all it said. Just that. Then it dropped to all fours and bolted into the underbrush like nothing had happened. Ace chased after it instinctively, barking twice before stopping short. He didn't pursue it. Just stood there, tail wagging slowly, tongue out. Like it had been a normal squirrel all along. I didn't chase either. I just stood there, heart pounding, lungs tight. That voice echoed in my head, not because of what it said, but because of how true it felt. Like it wasn't telling me anything new, just reminding me of something I'd spent years burying. I sat on a nearby rock, head in my hands. "You were meant for more." It sounded so simple when said aloud, but it felt like a sentence, a verdict. Ace came back and sat beside me. His breathing was calm. Mine wasn't. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just sat there and let the words rot inside me like fruit left in the sun. Eventually, we moved on. But every now and then I thought I saw movement in the trees. Tiny figures, just out of sight, watching, Waiting. Chapter 8. The clearing of choices. The path straightened, then split. Not into two, into five. We emerged into a clearing ringed by perfectly spaced trees, each trunk thick, gnarled and evenly apart like columns holding up a ceiling that no longer existed. The grass here was too green, the kind of green that doesn't happen in nature, almost neon under the gray light bleeding through the branches. In the center was a stump, freshly cut. No saw marks, no decay, just clean, like the tree had decided to leave and left the base behind as a souvenir. Ace stopped at the stump. He didn't sniff it. He didn't sit. He just stood still. The air pulsed. I took a step forward, and the moment I did, the forest shifted. A low hum vibrated in my chest, subtle, rhythmic, like breath, like a countdown. Each path called to me in its own way. The first whispered laughter, not cruel, nostalgic, children playing somewhere just out of sight. Warmth, something like safety, but it felt dishonest, too perfect, like a trap built out of memories that never really happened. The second stank of ambition. I could hear applause, low and slow and constant, footsteps on a stage. My name spoken by strangers, a version of success that looked like me but smiled too much. The third was silence. No sound at all, but I felt something there. A pressure behind the eyes, like stepping into a room where a terrible decision is waiting to be made, and no one else is coming. The fourth smelled like earth after rain. Comfort, familiarity, a life of quiet mornings and late evenings, and people who never asked too much. It was nice. It was nothing. And the fifth path made no sound, gave no scent, showed no sign, but I could feel it staring. Like the path itself wanted to be chosen, not for me, for it. I turned to Ace. He hadn't moved. I looked at the paths again. No signs, no marks, no hints, just choices. I felt it then, what the forest wanted me to believe, that I had power here, that this was my story, and my decision would shape what came next. But it was a lie. These weren't choices. They were invitations. Each one already knew who I was, what I'd do, where I'd end up. And that's when Ace barked. Just once. Sharp. He turned and walked toward the third path. The silent one. No hesitation. No looking back. I didn't follow right away. I stood there, surrounded by the ghosts of roads not taken, letting them ache. Then I stepped off the stump and followed the silence. Because Ace had already chosen. And maybe that was the only real choice I had left. Chapter 9. The buried thing. The silent path narrowed. No birds, no wind, not even the sound of my footsteps, though I knew I was walking. It was like the trail had swallowed noise itself. It was a few paces ahead, ears twitching every so often, like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. He moved slower. Now, not cautious, just deliberate, like every step meant something. That's when I tripped. A shallow rise in the earth caught my boot, and I fell hard, palms catching dirt and something else, metal. I looked down. It was just barely poking through the soil. Rusted, bent, familiar. I brushed it off and felt my stomach twist. It was a broken wristwatch. My old one. I hadn't seen it since high school. The band was still frayed where I chewed on it during tests. The face was cracked. Stopped at 217. No way it was real. I hadn't brought it. I hadn't even thought of it in years. I knelt and started digging. The soil gave way too easily. Soft and cold, like something had been waiting under it. Inch by inch, more of it revealed itself. Books I never finished. Notebooks half filled with plans I never followed through on. The corner of a photograph I tore in half during an argument and never apologized for. And beneath all of that, movement. A root, pale, almost translucent, like a vein that didn't belong to anything still alive. It slithered under the dirt and wrapped slowly around my wrist. I couldn't move. It wasn't tight. It wasn't painful. It just held me. Not like it wanted to keep me down. Like it wanted me to listen. The root pulsed once. And suddenly, I remembered everything I had buried. Not forgotten. Buried. Every missed call I never returned. Every dream I shelved with the excuse of timing or money or doubt. Every chance to speak up, to fight, to leave, to try, sealed under layers of excuses I called logic. The root pulsed again. It felt like a heartbeat, but not mine. I couldn't breathe. Then I heard the growl. Ace. Low. Dangerous. I looked up. He was standing over me, teeth bared, eyes locked on the root. He lunged. His teeth sank into the pale tendon and ripped. It let out a sound, not a scream, not a howl, but a wet sigh, and recoiled into the earth. I scrambled back, hands shaking, breathing hard. Ace stood guard until it vanished completely. Then, as if nothing had happened, he turned and kept walking. I stayed there, staring at the hole I'd dug. The things I'd unearthed. None of them were coming with me. I covered them back up, not to hide them, just to leave them where they belonged. Chapter 10. The Hungry One. It started with fog. Thin, at first, like breath on glass, curling around my ankles as the trail dipped into a low basin between two hills. The trees here leaned in closer than they should, arching above like ribs, like a cage. Ace stopped, just stood there. I stepped up beside him. Then the fog spoke, not with words, with sound, a deep droning rumble beneath the earth, like something impossibly large shifting in its sleep. The air vibrated with it, not loud, but total, like silence stretched too far. Ace growled, the first real growl I'd heard from him since we started this walk. And then I saw it, a shape, massive, lurking just beyond the fog, not approaching, just waiting. It didn't have a form, not a clear one. It shimmered, pulsed, flickered. Sometimes it looked like a beast, sometimes like a man, sometimes like something in between. But no matter how it shifted, one thing stayed the same. It was hungry, not for flesh, not for blood, for regret, for wasted years, for the pieces of myself I never used. It fed on it, lived on it, grew fat on everything I could ven. And now it was here, to collect. It didn't speak, not in language. It just opened itself, and I felt myself being pulled forward, like gravity, like guilt. I fell to my knees. Images poured into my head, or moments I'd almost forgotten. Not big ones, not tragic ones, just tiny fractures. Passing someone crying on a park bench and not stopping. Ignoring the email asking for help because it was bad timing. Every time I said I'm fine when I wasn't, just to make things easier for someone else. The fog thickened. My chest got tight. My vision swam. And then Ace stepped between us. He didn't bark, didn't growl again. He just stood there, facing the thing, still, defiant, untouchable. And the thing hesitated. The hunger slowed. I felt it recoil, not in fear, but in confusion. Like it couldn't see him, like it didn't understand him. And that pause was all I needed. I stood, dizzy, soaked in sweat, my legs weak, but I stood. The thing flickered one last time, shifting into a shape I couldn't process, and then it folded in on itself, collapsing like smoke sucked into a vacuum. The fog thinned. The air cleared, and Ace turned around, gave me a short breath of a look that felt like, come on, and walked ahead. I followed, still shaking, still hollow, but not empty. Not yet. Chapter 11. The Truth Grove. The trail leveled out into a stretch of trees spaced too perfectly to be natural, not planted, but placed, like pillars in a cathedral built from memory and rot. The ground was soft beneath my feet, but not muddy, pliable, like it could absorb anything, footsteps, sound, even thoughts. Ace slowed as we approached. He didn't stop this time. He didn't need to. I knew what was coming. The air here was thick with the weight of silence, but not the empty kind. This silence had substance, like sound existed here, but it had been gagged and buried just beneath the dirt. I stepped into the grove, and the trees spoke my name. Not all at once, one at a time. Low, whispered, calm, cold. They didn't accuse. They didn't need to, because they didn't repeat anything I hadn't already told myself. They just echoed it back, You knew you were drifting. You waited for a sign instead of making a move. You thought wanting to be good was the same as being good. You let time decide what kind of person you were going to be. I clenched my fists. I know, I whispered. The trees fell silent. For a moment. Then they laughed. Not cruel, not mocking. Just knowing. Then why didn't you stop? I didn't answer. Because I didn't have one. Ace sat at the edge of the grove, just outside the tree line. Like something told him not to enter. Like something in him knew this part wasn't his to witness. He waited. I moved deeper. With each step the trees got older, not taller, just older. Their bark blackened. Their roots warped into the shapes of hands, of faces, of pages filled with words I never wrote. And then I found it. At the center of the grove, a tree with my face, carved by time, not etched, grown. The features warped slightly, but it was me. Hairline, jaw, even the faint scar above my eyebrow from when I fell off my bike at 10. I stared into its wooden eyes, and it blinked. Once. Then it spoke in my voice. You brought yourself here. Don't pretend you didn't. I wanted to deny it. I wanted to scream. But I just stood there, staring at what I could then, if I'd ever had the guts to grow into it. The tree split down the middle, not violently, just opened, a vertical wound, revealing nothing but darkness inside. An invitation. Ace let out a single sharp bark behind me. Not a warning. A reminder. Time to move. I turned away from the tree. I didn't step inside, because I knew whatever was in there knew me better than I did. And if I entered, I'd never come back out. I left the grove. The trees didn't stop me. They didn't need to. They'd already said enough. Chapter 12. The Grow. The trail narrowed again. Roots coiled over it like veins beneath skin. Every step felt softer than it should, less like ground, more like flesh. The bark of the trees looked darker here, as if it had soaked up everything I'd said, everything I hadn't, and was holding it tight just beneath the surface. Ace stayed close now, right at my side. No longer leading, just walking with me. That scared me more than anything else so far. I didn't notice when the pain started. Not at first. It wasn't sharp. It wasn't sudden. Just there. In my chest, in my legs, in the way my fingers no longer felt like they belonged to me. The air was colder, but I wasn't shivering. I looked down at my arms. My skin was dry, splintered, discoloring. No bark. It was subtle but spreading, cracks forming at the joints, tiny splinters pushing from under the fingernails. I flexed my hand, and something fell from my palm, dark and brittle like a dead leaf that used to be part of me. I didn't scream. What would have been the point? Ace noticed. He sniffed at the leaf and looked up at me. He didn't bark. He didn't run. He just looked sad. And that broke something in me. Because he knew. The forest wasn't taking me. I was becoming it. A trade, not a theft. The price of every truth I let bury itself. Every year I stood still. Every chance I didn't take. The forest had just been patient, waiting for me to make the walk. I stopped walking. Ace stopped too. There was a clearing up ahead, and I knew without seeing it that it was the end. Or close enough. I knelt. It hurt. My knees cracked like branches underfoot. My spine pulled tight like something was growing along it. Ace licked my face. I almost laughed. "Doe," I whispered. He didn't move. Please. Still nothing. I reached up, hands barely mine anymore, and gave him a push. He took a step back. Another. He looked at me like he didn't want to understand, but did. Then he turned and walked. I watched him go. I thought I would cry, but no tears came. Just wind. Just leaves. Just the forest taking shape inside me. Chapter 13. The Watcher in the Green. The clearing wasn't wide. Just a break in the trees barely large enough for one person to stand in. But it felt endless. The light here was different. Not gray, not golden. Just green, soft and thick and slow, like being underwater in a place where the world had never learned to rush. I stood in it. Or what was left of me did. My skin no longer itched. My breath no longer came hard. The change had finished what it started. I wasn't bone and blood anymore. I was bark. I was root. I was still. And across the clearing, Ace stood at the edge of the trees staring back. He didn't come to me. He didn't need to. He had already done his part. He had walked beside me the entire way, without fear, without complaint, without expectation. He had guided me through the judgment, the silence, the unraveling. And when it was time, he had stepped away, because Ace had nothing to atone for. He wasn't part of the forest's hunger. He was never meant to pay for my choices. He was only there to witness them, to show me the way, one last time. I hadn't followed. Not really. Then what I always did. Made it almost to the end. And stopped. Fell just short in the middle of the road. The green light thickened, folding over the clearing like a second skin. I felt no pain, no anger, no regret. Only the soft hum of something ancient wrapping around me, pressing me into the earth like a truth finally spoken out loud. Ace turned. He walked, further down the path, slowly, steadily. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. I watched him until the trees swallowed his shape completely. And then there was nothing left but me. Still, quiet, a watcher in the green. Gang stalking, demons. I had one experience I'll never forget. I want you to one day share if possible. One day I was biking home from an old friend's house, when all of the sudden headlights came out of the intersection ahead of me, just sitting there waiting. I bike past, and they pull out onto the road and start following me fast. I bike behind a grocery store. You know how there is those long stretches of road behind, like a Fred Meyer's. Well, that's exactly what it was, and I'm going down that strip. Car is stopped a little bit, sways behind me. Then all of the sudden another truck pulled into the other side, forcing me to turn around and just bike past. The other car, currently chasing me, stopped a ways behind. I passed them both. People in the car locked eyes with me and wouldn't look away. This is where things got creepy. Next thing you know, I'm in the store walking around begging the managers for help, making a scene, and these people who are following me all park, get out of their vehicles, and start walking in the store, trailing me, but keeping a distance but remaining to have eye contact. The manager said he couldn't see whoever I was seeing. Almost felt like that curse in that recent Smile movie. I haven't felt that scared before in my life. My mother came to pick me up, and when she arrived they were still in the store, as I cowered in fear behind the customer service desk. Then I rushed to my mother when she arrived and got in the car, and told her to speed off. She did, and I thought I was in the clear, but oh boy was I wrong. Next thing you know, we arrive home, and I immediately get this feeling again, start creeping up my body. I rush inside, but don't feel safe. I have 4 cats, and none of them were to be found when this was happening. Almost like they were drawn away from me. Next thing you know, I settle down in my room, or at least try to, and look at my Ring doorbell camera, and see multiple people standing on my porch and around the porch area smiling at me, repeating that I'm going to die over and over and over again. I began to start to think I was hallucinating until this happened. I call the cops. They arrive and say they don't see anybody, and either do I. It's like they scared them off. This is where things get Black Mirror slide white. Zone fucking weird. I gave a cop my info, and in return he gave me his number. I know, very odd. But that's not it. He texted me throughout the night to check up on me, which is so weird because cops don't do this. My mother witnessed all of this. I sent him pictures of the outside of my window showing him the figures and things I was seeing, but he still didn't notice any of it. See that? Nobody there. Nothing there. Were the last text I sent and received, after about 9 hours of feeling like complete shit, and overall cursed or something. My mother pulls me aside and prays with me, which I never thought of even doing, because I'm not very religious. But let me tell you, it worked, because immediately all of this weird stuff went away, and everything returned back to normal. Oddly enough, my cats came back around, and things were looking good. And then, I text the number of the cop I got the night before, and they reply, "Who is this?" "You're the officer that gave me his number the last night." This is my first time receiving text from this number. Maybe you have the wrong number. My heart fucking sank. What if was happening to me that night? To this day, I talk about that situation, and still can't come to a logical conclusion. Gang stalking maybe? I deck. But this was the most horrific thing I've ever experienced in my 24 years alive. The things I seen that day were definitely bought. If this world or realm, let me tell you, you can feel the hate steaming off these beings. And they would tell me things, you're gonna die, while others behind them plot my demise, and I had to listen to every word. This lasted for hours until it didn't. Whatever these things / people were, they wanted me dead and gone, but for some reason couldn't enter my household. I really lost my shit. When my mother eventually told me about a week after that, she asked Jesus to test me to my limits, so that I wouldn't want to go back to the lifestyle I once had, which was heavy drug use. Let me just say, he tested me to the brink of insanity. If I had to live my whole life like that, I'd kill myself. You don't know how horrible this experience was for me. I get big goosebumps just speaking about it. Probably should put this in the beginning, but I live in Anchorage, Alaska, small city with not too many people, and I live in a very suburban neighborhood with very few neighbors. Goodnight Hotel. I check in early, as I always do when traveling. The walls are old and yellowed. It's evidently an older hotel than I thought. At first I don't mind. There's something satisfying about having an actual key to your room, rather than a key card. Makes me feel like I'm living in a simpler time. As I finish checking in, I turn around to head to my room. I see a woman sitting on the weathered bench, sobbing profusely. I ponder whether I should say something to her, but I decide against it. I make it to my room. It's dimly lit with ancient light fixtures. All wood furnishings make up the room. Again, it's old, but I kind of enjoy it. Yellow curtains line the window. The neon glow of the hotel sign gleams in through them. I unpack my things and call it a night. That morning I awake before the sun rises, ready for my early morning run. I exit my room and head down the poorly lit stairs. As I round the corner, I jump in fright. Hanging from the window is a woman in a bright red dress. Her black hair covers most of her face, but it's still a ghastly sight. My head swirls with anxiety. I feel like I may pass out. I dart down the rest of the steps, shielding my eyes as I run past the poor woman's body. I make it to the front desk, frightened and out of breath. There's no one at the desk, so I ring the bell. Anxiously, I wait. No one shows up. Ringing the bell over and over now. I'm growing impatient. I call out to see if anyone is working. They must be. Yes, it's early, but this is a hotel. Don't they usually have something at the front desk at all hours? I left my phone in the room, so I decide to walk to a police station. I head for the door, only to find it won't open. No matter how hard I try, it won't budge. Pondering what to do, I decide to head back to my room and call the police on my phone. It takes a long time, but I work up the courage to walk back up those stairs. As I reach that dreaded corner, she's gone. The woman is no longer there. A chill runs down my spine. I sprint back to my room, locking the door behind me. I grab my phone and dial 911, but the call won't go through. I open the door. The woman stands in the hallway before me, her black hair still covering her ghastly face. Her dress is now white. She meanders towards me. I scream and shut the door. The door bangs and a horrific growl comes from the other side. I stand and stare at the door in horror. The noises slowly fade away, but I'm still on edge. I wrap myself in my covers, on full alert. My eyes don't blink for hours. A knock at the door makes me nearly jump out of my skin. Room service. Still scared and unsure. I approach the door. Hesitantly, I crack it open. Sure enough, a short older lady stands there with a cart of towels and bedsheets. I run past her into the hallway. She shoots me a judging glance. I sprint my way down the now empty stairs, approaching the front desk once again. I try to open my mouth to explain what I'd seen, but nothing comes out. The woman at the front desk stares at me. I turn around and head for the door, grabbing the handle. It's locked. "You can't leave, sir." "What?" She smiles. I fear I may have to make my way up those stairs once more, and that dreaded woman may very well be waiting for me. Frantic, I to how to escape, but the door won't budge. I pick up a chair and smash it on the window, crawling out of it, making my way outside. It's now dark outside, even though only seconds ago it was sunny. I wander about alongside the silent, grassy riverbank. A horrible noise breaks up the silence. Coming from the other side of the river is a horrible scream, though I cannot see where the noise originates from because of the tall grass, and frozen in fear as the scream only grows louder and then abruptly stops. Following this, I hear a thump, and then something rolling down the grassy hill, followed by a splash. It's fallen into the river. Stunned, I stare ahead, not knowing what to do. Then more splashing follows, closer and closer. Something or someone is swimming towards me. I jet off in the opposite direction. I must have run for 3 hours straight. When I finally stop, I look up, only to see I'm back at the hotel. Footsteps steadily grow louder behind me, so I have no choice but to enter the hotel once more. The cabin was alive with laughter as the group of friends settled in for their annual winter retreat. Outside, the snow blanketed the landscape in a thick, glistening layer, transforming the world into a winter wonderland. Inside, the warmth of the fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the wooden walls. The scent of pine mingled with the rich aroma of hot cocoa and whiskey, creating a cozy atmosphere. They shared stories of past trips, reminiscing about the exhilarating slopes, the laughter that echoed through the nights, and the strange, unexplainable sights they had encountered along the way, moments that had become cherished memories, and inside jokes among them. The forbidden ski resort. As the night wore on, Jake, emboldened by the warmth of the whiskey coursing through him, leaned back in his chair, a playful grin on his face. "Hey, remember that ski resort we went to 2 years ago? That place was..." "Sure." Emma's voice sliced through the cozy atmosphere like a shard of ice. Her eyes flicked anxiously to the windows, where the wind howled and the snow swirled violently outside, as if the snow itself were listening. The laughter in the room faded, replaced by a heavy silence. The others exchanged anxious glances, their earlier smiles now replaced with unease, sensing the weight of unspoken memories hovering in the air like a ghost. "What?" Jake protested, confusion knitting his brow. "What's the big deal? Don't talk about it, never bring that trip back up." Mia whispered urgently, her voice trembling slightly, as if the very mention of it could summon something dark. She leaned closer, her wide eyes reflecting the flickering firelight, filled with a mix of fear and desperation. "Don't you remember? We agreed never to mention it again." Mia's tone was serious, almost pleading, as she glanced nervously at the door, as if expecting it to burst open at any moment, unleashing the specters of their past. The atmosphere grew thick with unspoken dread, wrapping around them like the chilling wind outside. "It wasn't an accident," Mark interrupted, his voice low and gravelly, cutting through Jake's bravado like a knife. He leaned forward, the firelight casting harsh shadows across his face, revealing the lines of worry etched deep into his brow. "You know what happened after that." His words hung heavily in the air, a chilling reminder of the chaos and fear they had faced, and the haunting memories that still lingered in the corners of their minds. Jake rolled his eyes, trying to dismiss the tension that hung in the air like a thick fog. Yet, the unease in the room was palpable, each of his friends stiffening at the mention of their shared past. "Come on, it was just a freak accident. The avalanche was a fluke." The fire crackled softly, sending up occasional sparks that flickered like fireflies, while the shadows danced on the walls, twisting into ominous shapes. Jake scoffed, trying to mask his unease, but the weight of their words hung heavily in the air, thickening the atmosphere around them. "You guys are being ridiculous. It's extremely sad we lost Tony to the avalanche," he said, his voice tinged with frustration, but blaming his disappearance on something that wasn't even there is just delusional. He leaned back, crossing his arms defensively, though a flicker of doubt crossed his face. "Besides, I believe Tony is still out there. I don't think he died in that avalanche." His conviction felt fragile, as if the very act of saying it could shatter the hope he clung to, and the room fell silent, each person grappling with their own memories of that fateful day. Jake opened his mouth to argue, but the words caught in his throat as he noticed the eerie silence that had settled over the room, amplifying the tension. Outside, the wind howled like a wounded animal, and a sudden chill swept through the cabin, causing the flames in the fireplace to dance erratically. The lights flickered ominously, casting elongated shadows that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. In that moment, a wave of memory surged back, crashing over him. The frantic escape through the snow, adrenaline coursing through his veins, the shadows lurking just beyond the tree line, watching and waiting, and the visceral sense of being hunted, as if something unseen was trailing them through the darkness. The recollection gripped him, and for the first time, doubt crept into his mind, challenging his earlier bravado. Emma leaned forward, her expression grave, the firelight casting deep shadows across her features. "We barely made it out alive," she said, her voice quivering with the weight of the past. "Yeah," Mia chimed in, a shiver running down her spine, as if the memories were a chill that seeped into her bones. "I still have nightmares about it. Those whispers we heard, I still hear them from time to time." Her eyes widened as she recalled the eerie sounds that had pierced the howling wind, a haunting echo that refused to fade. The room felt colder, the flickering flames suddenly inadequate against the creeping dread that enveloped them, as they collectively confronted the shadows of their shared trauma. "All right, fine," Jake said, swallowing hard, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. "Let's change the subject." But the very act of trying to dismiss the haunting memories seemed to stir something in the atmosphere. A restless energy that crackled around them. The lights flickered again, this time more violently, buzzing with an unsettling urgency before plunging the room into darkness. The sudden absence of light felt suffocating, wrapping them in an oppressive silence that was almost tangible. Panic surged through Jake as he glanced around, the familiar shapes of the room now distorted and menacing in the pitch black. This time, there was no reassuring glow to guide them back to safety, only the weight of their fears pressing in from all sides. "What happened?" Mia whispered, her face pale, the dim light casting an ashen hue over her features. "Just the wind," Mark replied, though uncertainty laced his voice, making it clear he wasn't entirely convinced. He glanced toward the windows, where shadows danced ominously against the glass, and the howling wind outside seemed to echo his unease. "There's supposed to be a snowstorm coming. I just checked the weather before we lost power. We should probably leave by tomorrow morning so we're not caught in the storm, you know, like the last time." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, conjuring memories of that fateful day when they had been trapped, helpless and terrified, as nature unleashed its fury upon them. The thought sent a shiver down Mia's spine, and she instinctively wrapped her arms around herself, as if to ward off the chill of the past. "Yeah, Mark is right," Emma said, her voice tinged with fatigue. "Maybe we should call it a night. I mean, the lights are out anyway." Mia nodded in agreement, her eyes darting nervously to the dark corners of the room, as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. But Jake brushed aside their suggestions with a wave of his hand. "If you guys want to go to bed, feel free, but I'm staying up and having another drink. Care to join me, Mark?" he asked, a hint of defiance in his tone. "You'll have one more," Mark replied, glancing between Jake and the door leading to the bedrooms. "But then I'm with the ladies. If we leave tomorrow morning, you don't want to be too hungover." His voice was light, yet the underlying tension in the air made it clear that even a casual drink felt like a gamble in the face of uncertainty. The flickering embers in the fireplace cast a warm glow, contrasting sharply with the chilling darkness outside, as if the cabin itself was urging them to retreat from the night's creeping dread. Yeah, Jake said, the burn of the alcohol already warming his cheeks and dulling the edges of his worries. As Emma and Mia headed upstairs to prepare for bed, their footsteps fading into the creaking floorboards, Jake sank deeper into the worn sofa beside Mark. The flickering fire cast a soft glow, illuminating the room in a warm, intimate haze, while Mark lit a cigarette, the smoke curling lazily into the air. They chatted about sports, lively debates about teams and games that filled the space with a sense of camaraderie. The conversation shifted to skiing, with both men reminiscing about past trips, the thrill of racing down slopes, and the camaraderie of the lodge. Then, with a hesitant breath, Mark opened up a little about his crush on Emma, his voice lowering as if sharing a secret. He described her laughter, the way her eyes sparkled when she spoke, and the way she seemed to light up the room. Jake listened, a knowing smile creeping onto his face, the warmth of the alcohol mingling with the warmth of friendship. Yet the underlying tension of the night lingered just below the surface, reminding them of the shadows outside. "Yeah, that's the thing," Mark replied, a frown creasing his brow. "We're just friends. I don't want to make things weird." His gaze drifted to the flickering fire, as if seeking answers in the dancing flames. "You'll never get your answer unless you go for it," Jake said with a dismissive shrug, tossing back the last of his drink and feeling the warmth spread through him. He set his glass down with a thud on the coffee table, the sound echoing in the quiet room, and then turned to Mark. Curiosity piqued. "Say, what's up with you and the ladies about that ski resort? I get it was tragic, but I mean, it's been 2 years, man. Dude, you should just tell her. We've all been friends for a while," Jake said, leaning back into the cushions, the alcohol giving him a sense of boldness. Growing up, I was afraid of the dark. Now I know why. I've never been a fan of the dark. When I was a kid, I would wake up in hysterics drenched in sweat. Even when there were 5 nightlights plugged in, my parents would awake to the cries of, "No, no, please don't leave me." Medication didn't help. Therapy. My parents were at their wits' end. Eventually, as I got older, the night terrors would subside somewhat, and peaceful sleep returned. I never could sleep in total darkness, however. A light from the hall, glaring videos from my phone, or draping myself in the blue light of television. Whatever it took to stave off the void. Over the summer, my parents went on an extended vacation and asked me to house sit for them, having just graduated and wandering aimlessly as I fumbled to get my career on track. I didn't really have a reason to say no. My folks lived in a 2-story on the outskirts of town. Not out of the way, but a decent walk from the nearest neighbor. It was a warm June, and as I tidied up the den, I realized I had nothing to do but watch TV and job search. All my friends were on their own rich kid-fueled vacations, and I didn't even have enough money for takeout. I reflected on this grim outlook as the news blared in the background, and I scrolled through Indeed for listings. Before I knew it, it was dusk, the tangerine haze starting to creep in. That's when I first heard it. Krog? Krog? I paused in my self-loathing, looking puzzled. I muted the TV and focused on it. Krug, krug, tap, tap, tap. Something was shuffling around somewhere. It sounded like it was coming under the floorboards. Ridiculous, of course. My parents didn't have a cellar. They just put all their trash and family memories out in the shed. Tap, tap, tap. CRRKT. Louder. Now, it was coming from under the stairs. My heart sank, remembering the dank crawl space under the stairs. You could walk right in. The circuit breaker was located in it after all. But to tread further, one would have to get on their hands and knees and slip into a tight cubby. Then they would gain access to the skeleton of the house. I shuddered at that thought, dismissing the sound as a rodent trapped in the walls. Not very brave of me, I know, but I avoided that crawl space like the plague as a kid. One time I had woken up in the night, another night terror, but my parents were nowhere to be found. My safety nets were out as well. I was alone in the pitch. I could hear my father cursing from downstairs, but I was too frightened to call out for him, let alone head down. Instead, I tried to calm myself and focus on the moonlight drifting in from the windows. It was faint, hidden by branches and clouds, but it was trying to burst through. As long as I had the moon, I wasn't truly cast into the dark. The shadows danced to the tune of my overactive imagination. Little imps swaying back and forth in the night. Tucked away in the corner was one shadow larger than the rest. It was shapely and tall. It loomed in the corner like an uninvited guest. My little eyes were glued to it as the figure started to rise. It grasped the corner of the with unseen arms, like it was ready to pounce. Then a click from downstairs, the night lights returned. The figure vanished. The wailing resumed. My mind was flooded with memories now, of shadows lurking, and that knowing feeling of being watched. Losing myself in introspection, I heard the sudden hiss of the TV snapping off, and found myself alone in a room full of dying light. Panic started to set in, and I immediately turned on the flash on my phone. Glancing around the room, I heard the chittering resume. Crocked, crocked, pa bang. I jumped at the sound, my heart drowning in my chest, as I realized it was the crawlspace door slamming open. As the sun set, the sounds of some unseen thing grew bolder. It was under me, besides me, above me. At times it sounded like the thing was in me. I could feel my breath start to choke on itself, and I rushed forward, desperate to turn the power back on. I slid and skittered on the ancient hall carpet. As I hyperventilated, I could feel the nothing begin to crush me. I raised my light towards the crawlspace door. It was hanging ajar, the sound emitting deep within the bowels of the house. For a moment, I thought of just leaving, just getting into my car, booking it to the nearest hotel. But then that wouldn't be rational. That would be the actions of a cowardly 22-year-old who still sleeps with the light on. I froze in the hall trying to collect myself. This was it, I told myself. I was going to puff up my chest and march into the crawl space. This sound probably wasn't even real. It was probably my own mind hyping up my hysteria. Today was the day I stopped being afraid of the dark. How naive I was. As I approached the door, I was overwhelmed by the musty stench of old wood and cobwebs. I aimed my flashlight down and expected the dust-covered floor. Messy dots like someone were dragging their fingers along the floor disturbed the muck. I brushed that off and stepped in. I was hunched over immediately, the ceiling cutting off a foot below my height. Ahead of me was a wall to my left, and the breaker in front of me. The lid dangled open, like someone had torn it out in a hurry. My heart fluttered. I hurried over to inspect it. The fuse box was completely torn apart, wires laying in a tangled mess and breakers smashed to bits. Or skirt. To my right, I turned to face the angled cubby, glancing down to see something long and hairy drag itself across the floor. I nearly dropped my phone in shock. I turned to run, and the door slammed shut. No, 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 no. Oh God, no. I cried out in panic. I pried at the door to no avail. I was huffing and puffing like a madman, clawing at the door until my fingers bleed. I collapsed to the ground, grasping at my chest. The air grew heavy, the stench of decayed skin particles and mold beginning to take my nostrils hostage. As I buried my head in my knees, tears starting to swell. I heard it once more. Cracked, cracked. I shuddered at the sound, like fangs gnashing against each other. I glanced up, my eyes adjusting to the total black. The sound was coming from the cubby. It was beckoning to me, a siren's lure if I ever heard one. I ran through the options in my mind. I was trapped in this glorified walk-in closet. The only way out was to go deeper. I tried to be reasonable, whatever it was, probably an animal that had gotten in through a hole in the wall or something. A raccoon at worst. If it got in, there must be a hole somewhere, right? I could stuff myself in and escape this hell. Looking back, it was an awful choice, but it was the only one I had. I shone the light towards the cubby. It looked like I could squeeze in there, no problem. Holding my breath, I steadied myself and slowly shuffled towards it. With a grunt, I jabbed myself in there, my shoulders pinching my chest at the entrance. Crocked, crocked. I ignored the sound and moved forward, pushing myself like a worm wriggling in the mud. The light paved the way, dust dancing in the air. As I scurried along, I batted cobwebs and tendrils of matted fur out of my way. As I made my way, I soon found myself at the space between walls. The smell of sealant and puffy drywall wafted towards me. I jutted forward, my foot caught on something. I couldn't claw myself out without both hands, but that would mean throwing my phone aside. It would mean facing the chittering dark. I closed my eyes and tossed my phone forward. I heard it clutter to the floor a few inches away. I grabbed the top of the cubby and quickly twisted myself as best I could. I could only turn about halfway, but I felt my foot and kicked off whatever it was caught on. With a grunt, I pulled myself out of the cubby and into the skeleton of the house. I quickly turned and noticed my phone was a few inches further than where I tossed it. The space between the walls was surprisingly easy to move around in, and I strode over to the beacon of light at a brisk pace. Then the phone moved. I froze. Had I imagined that? I must have. The phone then moved again, quickly now, like it was running away on two legs. It was turning a corner, leaving me stranded. I swore and chased after it like a dog with a bone. I slammed into the wall at first, shaking the foundations, yet I was still close to the light. As long as I was close to it, I was fine. The thing was, it kept trying to escape from me. The phone was luring me deeper into the labyrinth of fiberglass. Turn after turn, mile after mile, I batted webbings and insulation out of my face. I was laser focused on my accursed phone. The inside of the walls stunk to high heavens, like poison and a strong perfume. I was scurrying along with the phone, ignoring the cracked, and know of the thing that lurked in here with me. I just had to get to the light. I was safe there. As long as there was light, I was alone. I almost tripped over myself as the device came to a sudden stop. The smell was strong here, rancid yet sweat and inviting. I paused and reached down to pick up my phone. I squinted at the solid beam of light, spotting my vision. I almost didn't see the long clawed fingers slowly reach beside me and pick up the phone. My hand shook as my eyes followed the light. The bottom of the thing was hairy and spider-like. It was like someone had taken a tarantula and blown it up to life size. It twitched its mandibles, as if coveting the air around me. Attached where the eyes of the spider would be was a long, thin torso. It was feminine in features, its skin leathery and ripe. It had long, broad shoulders that ended with curled fingers and terrifyingly long nails. It had silk-like hair, the color of the purest of ravens, that covered its pale face. As it brought the phone to its head, I saw that it was featureless, a blank canvas, yet I could tell it was glaring at me. With hate or desire, I could not tell. It outstretched its arms as best it could, and I could hear the voice of the spider monster in my head. "Embrace me, Billy," it cooed. The voice was heaven, like a nostalgic mix of all my old flames. It beckoned me closer, luring me in with 1,000 promises, and once, I hesitated, and it sensed it. I could hear horrid giggling in my mind, as it began to crush the phone in its hand. As the light disappeared, and the spider's form faded into the shadows, I heard that god-awful chittering noise. The voice in my head spoke once more. "Run then, little rabbit." Finally, I screamed as the thing hissed and lunged at me. I could feel its fuzzy limbs trying to dig into me. As the giggling in my mind turned ever sinister, I pushed it off me with great force and got up as quickly as I could. I was lost in the dark, the skittering of spiders all around me. They were gnashing their fangs, scuttling about, and weaving their traps for me. I ran. I slammed into walls, and every time I felt safe, I felt the spider's touch on my back. I felt her breath on my neck. It stank of meat oven pheromones. I pushed it back as best I could, forcing myself deeper and deeper into the everlasting tunnels. I could hear whispers in the dark, telling me such awful things. They wanted me to join them, to join her. I muttered, "No," over and over again, but they just wouldn't stop. The air was hot. It was blasting me in the face as I ran. I was cutting myself on the fiberglass. The taste of iron clung to my lungs. My heart was boxing my insides. I was surrounded on all sides by the thing. I could hear it inside. I clawed at my ears to get it to stop. Corked, corked, tap, tap, tap. CRRKTC, RRKTC, ATC, 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 RRKTC, 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 ETC, ETC. Shut up, I screamed at the top of my lungs. I pushed forward and my eyes stung at the sight of sudden light. I collapsed to the ground in a heap and heard gasps of shock and confusion. I was crumpled on the ground, coughing up drywall and screaming, my voice raspy and full of dust and sick. My parents helped me up, concerned at first, but then horrified at the state of me. My father was on the phone with someone, saying to send an ambulance, and that I had just fell out of the wall. I was dazed and confused. They had just left. What were they doing back so fast? Why did I feel so weak and hungry? My eyes struggled to adjust to the light, and my mom held me and wept. Apparently, I had been trapped inside the walls for 7 days. After 3 days of calling me with no response, my parents got on the first flight back and found no trace of me. They were calling the police in a panic when I had burst through the wall half crazed. I tried to explain what had happened, what I had seen back there in the walls, but the silent, judgmental looks my parents told me all I needed to know. There was a long talk, and it was decided I needed to take some time for myself and get some help. That was 3 weeks ago now. My parents have only visited me twice. They could barely meet my eyes. The doctors say I'm making progress, and soon I'll be ready, go home. Maybe they're right. Maybe it was all in my head. I sleep in a padded room at night, the only light creeping in from the moon and slightly under my door. I see shadows under it sometimes. Orderlies probably. Sometimes the shadows linger, and I hear that sound once more. It's all in my head. I'm sure of it. It still calls to me in my dreams. I haven't told the doctors. Sometimes I hear it in the walls, that familiar chitter. I suppose time will tell if I'm crazy or not. The next time I fall asleep in total darkness, if I don't wake up again, well then, I guess I wasn't crazy. That's it for tonight's stories, but the nightmares never end. If you enjoyed these chilling tales, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a new upload. Got a scary experience of your own? Share it in the comments. I just might feature it in a future video. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, some things are scarier than they seem in the dark.